Something doesn't add up here, and it's been bugging me for weeks. How did Native American tribes survive in places where even modern technology fails? In this video, I'm sharing the unbelievable truth about these ancient survival masters that will blow your mind. What you're about to discover will literally change how you see human potential forever. This journey into their secret world starts now. But before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more mind-blowing history, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Before the rifles, before the railroads, before the treaties written in disappearing ink, there was only the land, the wind, and the rhythm of footsteps pressing into the soft earth of the northern Rockies. Here, in the high country of what we now call Montana and Wyoming, where the Wind River cuts through limestone ridges like a blade through a hide, the story of the Crow people, Apsayluk, the children of the large-beaked bird, begins. They did not come from cities, nor from ships. They came from dreams, or so the elders say. In the beginning, there was a vision. A great bird soared above the earth, its wings casting shadows across entire valleys. Its beak was long, curved, powerful, a symbol of knowledge and cunning. To follow it was to find your path. To ignore it was to be swallowed by the land. The Apsaluka did not ignore the sign. They became it. Oral history speaks of a time when they were one with the Hidatsa, a powerful river people whose homes clung to the edges of the Missouri like muscle to bone. But something stirred within, a calling, a spiritual rift. The old ones whispered that a vision had been given to one among them, a young leader named No Vitals, who heard the wind speak of a new place, far west, where rivers ran clearer and the stars burned closer. So they followed. Families packed what they could carry: buffalo hide lodges, stone knives, the memory of corn and squash, and the sacred tobacco bundle. They crossed rivers with no names, crested ridgelines that tore at their moccasins, and forded through endless prairie grass that concealed wolves and enemies alike. And when they reached the Wind River country, the spirits of the land spoke back. To survive here meant more than muscle. It required understanding of weather, of herds, of water's silence before a freeze. The Apsayluk began to learn the language of the land. They learned to trap snowmelt in clay basins and to read the shifts in animal paths that marked coming storms. They fashioned tools not only from stone and sinew, but from intuition. The Wind River Valley, wild, brutal, and stunning, became more than home. It became the center of the world. The mountains here are not just peaks, they are guardians. Cloud Peak, Bald Mountain, and the icy crown of Gannett loomed above like frozen ancestors watching. At night, when the fire crackled low, the people told stories of wolf spirits, of shapeshifters, and of the great bird, still circling high overhead, unseen but always felt. In this land of raw wind and sudden snows, survival was a ceremony. A child learned to scrape a hide clean before their voice had even settled. Boys were taught to watch shadows long before they were trusted with a bow. Girls learned the secret of stitching rawhide while the wind howled at the lodge door. Elders did not merely advise, they carried memory, entire generations stored in the bend of a finger, in the way tobacco was laid at the base of a cottonwood tree. And when danger came, as it always did, it came not just from nature, but from other men. To the west lay the Shoshone, swift and skilled. To the north, the Blackfeet, relentless and fierce. There were no lines drawn on maps. The borders were the ridgelines you could defend, the water sources you could hold, the hunting grounds you could reach before the snow. Each step beyond camp was a gamble, a bet placed with your life as collateral. But the Apsayluk did not shrink. They adapted. In their hands, even the simplest tools became extensions of thought. An obsidian scraper, black and sharp as regret, could strip the hide from a bull elk in minutes. Fire drills made from willow were spun by fingers hardened by frostbite. And the lodgepoles, cut from lodgepole pine and lashed with sinew, could be packed, carried, and reassembled within hours, chasing the herds across miles of open ground. Their lives moved in seasons, not schedules. Spring meant scouting the thawing edges of riverbeds for early game. Summer brought movement, ceremony, and trade. Fall, urgency. The last buffalo must be taken before the wind turned cruel. Winter. Winter was a test of all things. Those who had planned survived. Those who hadn't became stories told around the fire to teach. And through all of it, the spirit of the great bird remained. In crow cosmology, this bird was not merely a totem. It was an ancestor, a force, a compass. It had led them west, and they believed it would never abandon them. Its cry echoed in the eagle-bone whistles used in sacred ceremonies. Its feathers adorned war shirts and prayer bundles. It was in the smoke, in the dreams, in the silence between drumbeats. But this land, as beautiful as it was, demanded sacrifice. A young warrior named Red Clay once tracked a wounded bull bison for 2 days through the ravines west of the Bighorns. The snow swallowed his trail, and when his flint snapped, he fashioned a new edge from shattered shale. He had only a sinew cord for his bowstring, already fraying. On the 3rd night, with his fire nothing more than glowing ash, he took down the beast with a single shot to the heart. He returned home with hide, meat, and a story, but 2 of his fingers blackened from frost never healed. These were not isolated tales. They were the currency of survival. Every old man's limp came from something real. Every scar on a woman's hands told of a night spent sewing by firelight, racing a storm to finish a child's winter robe. No tool was ornamental. No skill was optional. In the Wind River country, to be Apsaluk was to walk a thin line between reverence and ruin. And yet, they thrived. Not in the way outsiders measure wealth, but in spirit, in community, in knowledge passed hand to hand, bone to bone. They traded obsidian blades for beads, brought back horses stolen in daring raids, and sang war songs on the backs of mountain ridges where even the wind stood still to listen. They did not call themselves Crow then. That was the name given to them later by French traders, gens du corbeau, a mistranslation of their true name, Apsaluk, children of the bird with the long beak. But even that mistranslation could not dilute who they were. Not really. They were mountain scouts, elk whisperers, cloud readers. They were survivors in a time before roads, fences, or certainty. They were shaped by their land, and in turn they shaped it through migration, myth, and memory. The story of the crow begins not in a year, but in a feeling. The weight of wind before a storm, the silence of snow just before it falls, the endless stretch of a plain lit by firelight, and the eyes of those who remember. In the Wind River country, the Apsaluk became something more than a people. They became a legacy carved into earth, stone, and story. And that legacy was only just beginning. At sunrise, the plains speak. Not in words, but in signs. The hush of wind over tall grass, the flight path of birds, the first scent of smoke rising from a camp still wrapped in cold. For the Apsaluk, the crow, every element carried meaning, a whisper from the spirit world hidden in plain sight. In a world where survival depended on instinct sharpened by hardship, faith was not luxury. It was necessity. The sacred and the physical walked side by side, breath for breath. There were no clear lines between earth and sky, between dreams and waking life. To the crow, life was ceremony, and at the heart of that ceremony was the sacred tobacco bundle. Carried only by the most trusted of spiritual leaders, this bundle was more than hide and root. It was the axis of their world, a living thing imbued with memory, prophecy, and protection. Its origin was sacred, its power unquestioned. It did not belong to any one man or even a single generation. It belonged to the people, to the land, to the bird. When the tribe gathered in a circle before a journey, it was the tobacco bundle that decided whether the trail would begin at dawn or not at all. Inside it lay dried leaves of native tobacco, bound with sinew, feathers, and small sacred stones. Some bundles held locks of hair from warriors long dead. Others contained items gifted by visions, antler fragments, etched bone, bits of eagle claw. The bundle was not opened casually. It was consulted, its resting place selected with care, and its voice heard only through the prayers of the bundle keeper. A roll passed through visions and dreams, not bloodlines. One such keeper, remembered through story and smoke, was called Deer Above the Storm. He was not the fiercest warrior, nor the loudest voice, but he could see the signs others missed: a crooked branch pointing east, a dream of wolves drinking from an empty streambed, the silence of birds before a hunt. It was said he once stopped a war party on the very edge of battle just before dawn, after receiving a vision of their enemies lying in wait behind a bend of cottonwoods. The war chief protested. The scouts had seen nothing, but Deer Above the Storm insisted. They turned back. Later, it was found. 3 dozen Lakota had dug into the brush, waiting. His vision saved them all. But the sacred bundle was only one star in the vast sky of Crow cosmology. Above all, the morning star, Ichili as they called it, held special power. Each morning, before even the sun had cleared the mountains, the morning star glimmered against the black. It was the first eye to open, the first witness to life's awakening. Warriors prayed to it before battle. Women sang to it during childbirth. Children were taught to greet it with silence and respect. It marked not just time, but intention. In the old days, vision quests were timed by the morning star. A young man seeking guidance would leave the camp in secret, guided only by the star's light and his elders' words. He would fast, no food, no water, for 4 suns and nights, alone, stripped of comfort. His robe would be laid on stone, his body painted with river clay. He would wait for a dream, a sign, a visitor from the spirit world. It was not uncommon for him to return with fevered eyes, a new name whispered to him by thunder or owl, and sometimes he did not return at all. These quests were not rituals for decoration. They were contracts between soul and cosmos. If the morning star came to you in a dream, shining bright from the mouth of a bison or cradled in the hands of a dead relative, you were forever changed. Your role in the tribe was altered. You might become a singer, a healer, a scout, or you might bear burdens others could not understand: visions of death, warnings of illness, glimpses of betrayal. Some warriors, like Crow Speaks with Fire, became legend after such visions. He once dreamed of a red storm sweeping through the camp, carrying buffalo horns and broken spears. The next season, a rival band attacked, but forewarned, the Crow were ready. They drove the enemy off in one of the greatest defensive stands in their history. From that day forward, no chief made war without first seeking the dreams of Crow Speaks with Fire. But vision alone was not enough. Action was sacred too. The sun dance, the most grueling spiritual ordeal known to the Apsaluke, was a testament to this belief. In midsummer, when the buffalo had been plentiful and the tribe was strong, warriors would gather in a ceremonial lodge. For days, they danced beneath the scorching sun, circling the sacred cottonwood pole that pierced the earth like the spine of the world. Some would fast. Others would offer flesh, piercing their own chests with sharpened bone skewers, tethered to the central pole by rawhide cords. They would dance until the cords tore free or the sun fell, whichever came first. The blood was not just pain, it was offering. A contract with the divine. The cords symbolized their connection to the spirit world, the idea that all strength came from surrender. Mothers wept, elders prayed, children watched in silence, learning that endurance was holy. None of this was spectacle. Every ritual, every chant, every painted handprint carried the weight of generations. In a land of shifting loyalties and sudden storms, these ceremonies held the people together when nothing else could. The land listened. When a prayer was offered to the river spirits, the fish returned. When a song was sung beneath a dying tree, its roots bore medicine. When a dream warned of an early winter, scouts hunted farther, found the herds sooner, stored the meat deeper. Crow cosmology was not abstract. It was the daily logic of survival. Even in battle, the spiritual world was present. Warriors painted their faces according to visions, lightning bolts across the cheek for speed, bear paws on the chest for strength, eagle feathers tied into hair for protection. Shields were painted after dreams, sometimes wrapped in the hide of a specific animal that had appeared to the owner in a vision of danger or victory. Before a raid, a warrior might sit alone, singing quietly to a stone, not as superstition, but as preparation. Because to the crow, the world of the unseen shaped the world of the living. It was the sacred that dictated when to plant, when to move, when to mourn. When someone died, their belongings were placed on a scaffold high above the ground. Their body was given to the sky, not buried, because death was not an end. It was a journey upward. The spirit needed room to rise, to return to the star path. The family mourned not in silence, but in action, cutting their hair, slashing their robes, leaving food and water near the scaffold so the dead would not hunger. There was grief, yes, but never abandonment. As the tribe moved through seasons and generations, the sacred bundle remained, carried by horseback, by travois, even once hidden in the false bottom of a parfleche bag to avoid seizure by a cavalry patrol. And through it all, the morning star rose, again and again. Even now, generations later, when roads have carved across the plains and the buffalo have returned only in sanctuaries, the crow still speak of the star, still sing the old songs, still carry pieces of the bundle, sometimes in museums, sometimes in ceremony, sometimes in memory. Because for the Apsar-Luca, survival was never just muscle or arrow. It was belief that the world listens, that spirits guide, that each dawn brings more than light. It brings meaning. The wind never stopped moving. It swept across the high plains like a memory that couldn't be buried, cold in the morning, searing by midday, and always carrying with it the scent of open space and far-off hooves. This was the rhythm of the world for the Apsar-Luca, the crow, a people in motion, nomads of the bison, trail. Long before wagons carved ruts into the prairie, before rifles cracked over ridgelines, the crow were a foot-bound nation, moving slow, measuring their lives by the weight of what they could carry. Their homes were stitched hide, their tools chipped from stone, their feet blistered on rough soil, and their food came only after days of stalking or weeks of planning. The land offered no forgiveness. It only offered chances, and the occasional miracle. Then came the horse. It didn't arrive with ceremony. No prophecy marked its entry. But in time, it would change everything. Some say the first crow horse was traded for a bundle of obsidian knives and painted shields along the Missouri. Others say it was stolen, taken in a nighttime raid across the southern reaches of the Yellowstone, where Comanche herds grazed under loose guard. However it came, the result was the same. The plains shrank, the herds became reachable, and the crow were no longer earthbound. With the horse came flight. They were fast learners. Within a generation, crow hunters were riding bareback at full speed, bows drawn mid-gallop, leaning low enough to dodge a buffalo's swinging horns or to pluck an arrow from the dirt without dismounting. What once took days now took hours. A hunt became a chase. A raid became a dance. The buffalo, sacred, massive, and vital, remained the center of everything. But now, the crow could follow them deeper into the valleys and higher into the foothills. No longer tied to riverbanks or game trails, they became true roamers, pulling their camps behind them like sails chasing the wind. The travois made this possible, 2 long lodgepoles lashed together and dragged behind a horse, forming a triangle where women, children, and gear could ride across the prairie. Cradles were tied with rawhide, parfleches, flat, envelope-like containers made from sun-dried buffalo hide, carried everything from food to tools to sacred items. Painted with geometric designs, each one told its own story. They were backpacks, storage rooms, and heirlooms, all in one. And every journey began with calculation, not just of distance, but of risk. Where were the Blackfeet? Had the Lakota crossed the Powder River lately? Had the scouts spotted buffalo sign, or was it just antelope again? Every decision carried weight. Move too soon, and the herds might scatter. Move too late, and you might arrive in another tribe's path, or worse, their crosshairs. For all its vastness, the northern plains were never empty. In a single day, a Crow camp could disassemble and vanish, the earth brushed clean of footprints. The only traces were flattened grass and the faint scent of smoke in the air. The new camp would rise miles away, near a creek or windbreak, with lodges tilted just right to face morning sun. Fires were struck from flint and dry moss. Meat was boiled in rawhide kettles using hot stones, since iron pots were still rare. Bones were cracked for marrow. Sinew was strung and dried. Nothing was wasted. Everything was earned. Hunting, even with horses, remained dangerous. A mature buffalo bull could weigh over a ton and charge with the force of a collapsing tree. Hunters rode in formation, flanking the herd, then breaking forward in waves, loosing arrows into the thundering mass. Each kill was a combination of courage, timing, and years of muscle memory. One slip, one twisted hoof, and a rider could be trampled, tossed, or speared by the horns of a panicked beast. They called it Waksushe Aka Alasalia, to ride like the eagle hunts. A crow hunter named Elk Sings Twice became legend for this. During one hunt in the early spring, he rode so close to the herd that his pony was brushed by the shoulders of a running bull. His bowstring snapped mid-pull, but he reached for a lance, stood in the stirrups, and drove the blade into the animal's neck before vaulting off to avoid the fall. The buffalo collapsed, and so did Elk Sings Twice, his shoulder shattered, but his kill fed 3 families, and his name was never forgotten. Raiding became just as vital, not for slaughter, but for horses. The crow measured wealth not in beads or blankets, but in herds. A man with 20 horses was respected. A man with 50 was powerful. A man with none was vulnerable. Horses were freedom, food, war, and status all in one. And the only way to keep them was to steal more than you lost. Crow warriors moved under cover of darkness, faces painted with river clay, weapons wrapped to muffle sound. They slipped into enemy camps like ghosts, cut hobbles, and rode off into the night, driving a dozen, sometimes 50 stolen horses behind them. It was a high-stakes game, and the penalty for failure was often death. But the reward? The reward was survival and renown. Tools evolved too. Flint blades were replaced by trade knives. Iron awls made sewing faster. Bullet molds appeared, then powder horns. But tradition held firm. A bow made from the horn of a bighorn sheep, shaped by fire, sinew-wrapped and painted with symbols, was still considered sacred. Even when rifles came, many kept their bows. The silence was useful. So was the soul of the weapon. Cooking methods remained primal. Without pots, women boiled meat in hide containers by heating river stones in the fire and dropping them into the water until it bubbled. Fat was rendered into tallow. Organs were roasted whole. Stomach linings, cleaned and dried, were used as water sacks. Survival was an art of use, of seeing utility in every scrap. Children learned early. By the age of 6, a boy might already be riding alone. Girls were taught to tan hides, dye porcupine quills, and prepare medicine from root and bark. There was no waiting to grow up. The land would not wait for you. Storms came suddenly, sometimes so fierce they stripped bark from trees. Blizzards buried lodges in hours. Summer hail could kill a man outright. But the crow watched the signs, cloud shapes, bird patterns, the shift in the horse's breath. A smart scout could read the weather 2 days in advance. A smart chief trusted him. Still, even the wise made mistakes. Once, during a migration west of the Bighorns, a crow band misjudged the early frost. Snow came a month too soon. The travois broke under ice. The horses weakened. Buffalo were gone. Children coughed from smoke trapped in sealed lodges. A woman named Willow Teeth walked 30 miles alone to find a small herd, killed one with a bow, and returned with hide wrapped around strips of frozen meat. Her feet were black with frostbite, but 6 people lived because of her. Her story lived longer than she did. These were not romantic lives. They were earned, hour by hour. But there was beauty too. Nights lit by fire and drum, horse races across wide valleys, young lovers speaking in sign language beneath a buffalo robe. Stories passed from grandfather to child, stories of the first horse, the first trail, the first vision. The land remembered them. Even now, when highways cut through the old paths and fences frame the hills, there are still places where you can feel it. The trace of hooves, the echo of singing, the ghost of motion. The Crow were not conquerors of the plains, they were students of it. Masters, yes, but masters who listened, who adjusted, who never stopped moving. To be Crow was to ride, to hunt, to risk, to endure. They were not just nomads of the bison trail. They were its spine, its pulse, its memory. The prairie looked endless, but it was never empty. Every ridge, every coulee, every bend in a stream held shadows. And for the Crow, the Apsayaluka, those shadows often wore the faces of old enemies. The northern plains were a crucible of war. The land gave little and demanded much, and so those who called it home fought for every inch of it. For the Crow, survival was not just about chasing buffalo or outrunning the cold. It was about watching the horizon with a sharpened heart, knowing that somewhere beyond it, warriors from the Lakota, Cheyenne, or Blackfeet might be riding toward them, or worse, already watching. A Crow warrior once said, "We are born into war, and we grow into the silence it leaves behind." In those years, between the rising sun and the next ambush, life became a test of readiness, physical, spiritual, and emotional. No village was still for long. Scouts left before first light. Lodges were placed with escape in mind. Children were taught to listen to birds. If they scattered without reason, it meant danger. At night, firelight was shielded and weapons laid close at hand. No one slept deeply. The land allowed no softness. To their enemies, the Crow were fierce, fast, and unrelenting. And to themselves, they were guardians of their people, keepers of the story written not in words, but in scars and songs. Warfare for the Crow was ritual as much as it was survival. Young men were not considered true warriors until they had counted coup, the act of touching an enemy in battle with a hand, whip, or stick and returning alive. Killing was not the highest honor. Bravery was precision, control, the courage to ride through a storm of arrows just to place your hand on an enemy's chest and then vanish like mist. These men painted their faces with patterns shown to them in dreams. Each line had meaning. A red streak across the eyes might mean vision. White dots on the hands could represent hail, gifted by the thunder beings. Before battle, they prayed to the spirits of their ancestors, rubbed sacred earth on their arms, and tied amulets into their braids. Small bundles of fur, claw, or carved bone that carried protection from the unseen world. Shields were not mere tools of defense. They were sacred armor, often made from the thick hide of the buffalo's neck, hardened with boiling water and smoke, then painted with vision-inspired designs. A thunderbird, a running elk, a serpent curling through clouds. A shield was believed to carry the power of its symbol. Some were passed down through generations, never broken, never dropped. One such shield belonged to Arrow Wolf, a Crow warrior remembered in dozens of stories. He painted a black wolf chasing a spiral of stars across his shield, saying the wolf guided his spirit through darkness. In one winter raid, surrounded and cut off, he used the shield not just to block arrows, but to signal his companions with flashes of moonlight reflecting off its surface. They escaped. He lived. The shield was buried with him many seasons later, under a stone cairn facing east. But war was not just personal, it was territorial. The Crow homeland, rich in game, fresh water, and sacred mountains, made them targets. The Lakota to the east were expanding. The Cheyenne, swift and skilled, hunted the same buffalo herds. The Blackfeet, powerful and ruthless, controlled the northern trade routes and resented Crow movement through the river valleys. Raids happened often. Camps burned. Horses were stolen in the night. Warriors disappeared and returned days later with wounds packed in moss and the eyes of men who had seen too much. Women learned to pack a lodge in under 20 minutes. Children learned which route to chew to calm fear. Some winters, the Crow lost more men to ambush than to hunger. A boy named Takes Flint from Skye was only 10 when he saw his father killed by Cheyenne lances during a surprise raid at the Musselshell River. Hidden under a parfleche bag, he watched through the stitching as their camp was torn apart. Years later, he would return to that valley, now a man, and place a single painted stick in the ground beside the river. It bore the mark of his family, a broken arrow wrapped in crow feathers. He said nothing, but the mark remained, a quiet defiance in the land of ghosts. To kill an enemy was one kind of honor, to survive, another. But to return with a horse, that was proof of skill and vision. Horses were both prize and power. Each one taken from an enemy was a thread cut from their strength and woven into yours. The greatest warriors became famous not for the blood they spilled, but for the number of horses they brought home. They were celebrated in songs, their names sung as the women paraded through camp, leading the captured animals, each painted with red handprints. Raiding required silence, patience, and precision. A group might travel for days, sleeping under brush, moving only at night. They would reach an enemy camp and wait, sometimes for hours, watching the herd, mapping the guard rotations. Then, in a sudden burst, they would strike, cutting hobbles, shouting once to scatter the horses, and disappearing into the dark. But not every raid ended clean. A young warrior named Ghost Elk led a raid deep into Lakota country. They took 20 horses, a success by any measure. But a mistake in the retreat left them cornered by a returning war party. Ghost Elk was wounded in the thigh, bleeding and slowing. Rather than risk the lives of his companions, he drew the enemy off, riding into a canyon alone. He killed 2 before being taken. Weeks later, his shield was found hanging in a tree, a sign of respect from those who had killed him. Even enemies understood valor. With the arrival of white traders, the rules began to change. Guns appeared, first as novelty, then as necessity. At first, bows remained dominant. A skilled archer could fire 6 arrows in the time it took to reload a flintlock. But with time came repetition, and soon the rifle became a permanent feature of war. The Crow adapted. They traded hides for powder, learned to mend rifles, and marked the good traders from the liars. The French called them gens du corbeau, people of the crow. But names meant little. What mattered was leverage. With bullets came the ability to strike from farther away. With iron, a shield could be pierced, a lodge wall shredded. But even as the weapons evolved, the codes remained. A warrior still painted his body with sacred symbols. He still sought dreams before battle, and he still knew that each fight was not just for land, or game, or vengeance. It was for identity. To lose was not just to retreat. It was to risk being forgotten. Each wound became a story, each scar a lesson. A man might wear the feather of a hawk for his first horse raid, a claw for his first kill, a red line around his wrist for the brother he buried. Their clothes became maps of memory. The Crow did not seek war for glory. They fought because their world demanded it, because each sunrise brought the possibility that someone else would claim what their ancestors had died to hold. Enemies waited on all sides, but the Crow never flinched. They sharpened their blades, whispered to their horses, and trusted the wind to carry them home, or carry their names into legend. The smoke came long before the men. Thin, acrid, and unfamiliar, it curled through the cottonwoods like a whisper of something not quite natural. It clung to shirts, lodged in hair, and drifted across the valleys with a scent not of burning wood, but of civilization, creeping in like fog through a broken door. By the early 1800s, the Crow stood at a crossroads, though there was no map to follow, no clear trail to track, only the sharp edge of change. The fur trade was sweeping west like a wildfire, invisible until it was too close to stop, and at its front rode hard-faced men in patched coats, beaver pelts slung over pack animals, flintlock rifles strapped across their backs, and names like Manuel Lisa, Jim Bridger, and John Coulter whispered like omens around Crow campfires. They came for the river routes, for the pelts, for the promise of something they called commerce, a word with no equivalent in the Crow tongue, but one that would soon carve scars into the land and its people. The Apsaluka had always been traders. Long before the white men came, they bartered obsidian, horses, elk teeth, and sacred herbs with distant tribes. Their diplomacy was carried on moccasins, not letters. Their deals were sealed with song and story, not ink. But now, everything was different. The newcomers carried goods never seen before: iron pots, wool blankets, brass kettles, glass beads, and most of all, guns. To hold a gun was to wield thunder. A single musket could tip the balance of power in a skirmish. A repeating rifle could turn a raid into a massacre, and for a people surrounded by enemies, the temptation was immediate and heavy. A Crow warrior named Two Knives Bent once traded 3 fine horses and a buffalo robe painted with his war deeds for a single Kentucky long rifle. He'd seen what it could do. He'd watched as a trader fired into a tree from 50 paces, and the bullet passed clean through both sides. The look in the warrior's eyes wasn't fear, it was calculation. But the rifle came with strings wrapped in barrels of whiskey and weighed down by debt. Traders didn't deal in gifts, they dealt in cycles. You gave them fur, they gave you powder. You ran out of fur, they gave you whiskey. You wanted more powder, they told you to bring more pelts, beaver mostly, then otter, then whatever you could find. Trade turned to dependence, and dependence to danger. Alcohol, something the Crow had no history with, tore through camps like a winter sickness. It dulled the senses, slurred words into fists. Men once respected for their discipline were found stumbling, bloody, or silent. Women bore the burden, as they always had, shielding children from the night-long spirals of noise and regret. The elders saw the signs. Yellow Calf, a spiritual leader, warned the tribal council that the smoke of these white men did not rise like a blessing, but like a curse. Their fire eats the earth, he said. Their laughter hides teeth. But others, younger men, war leaders, scouts, saw something else. Opportunity. The fur trade brought goods, yes, but it also brought leverage. With guns came better defense against the Lakota. With wool came warmth through harsher winters. With kettles, food could be cooked faster. In their minds, this was not surrender. It was adaptation. And so the Crow entered what some called the age of moccasin diplomacy. They learned who could be trusted and who could not. They memorized the names of fort owners, watched the behavior of scouts, marked the paths of supply trains. Some Crow men even worked as guides, leading white trappers through dangerous valleys, steering them away from sacred grounds and rival war parties. Not out of loyalty, but calculation. Knowledge was now currency. Misinformation could be a shield. At Fort Raymond, on the Bighorn River, Manuel Lisa, a Spanish-born American fur magnate, established one of the first trading posts on Crow land. He understood that he needed them more than they needed him. He met with chiefs, gave gifts, and promised protection. In return, the Crow offered pelts, horses, and passage. But trust was not easy to buy. At night, scouts kept watch on the fort's movements. If rifles were loaded, it was noted. If strangers arrived, word was sent to the villages. If prices changed without reason, a warning arrow might be left on the trail the next morning. In those days, Crow diplomacy walked on thin ice. One wrong step could shatter alliances built over months. One insult, real or imagined, could cost lives. A single rumor could turn a neutral tribe hostile. The Crow adapted by becoming observers of men. They studied tone, body language, silence. A glance held meaning. A pause meant something had been left unsaid. There was strength in restraint, too. When a young warrior named Drink's Iron shot and killed a white trapper during a dispute over a stolen horse, the tribal elders held council. Vengeance was demanded by the trader's companions. But instead of war, the Crow offered restitution: 20 beaver pelts, a ceremonial bow, and a personal apology delivered by a war chief. It wasn't submission, it was survival, and it worked. Still, the tension never truly eased. The fur economy was ravenous. Beavers, once abundant, began to vanish from familiar streams. Otters, foxes, and minks followed. Rivers were picked clean. Some bands traveled farther, deeper into enemy territory, in search of fur. And the farther they went, the thinner the line between trade and war became. The Blackfeet, already bitter rivals, now sought control of the upper Missouri trade routes. Skirmishes became ambushes, camps were burned, trapper parties disappeared without a trace. In one season alone, 3 crow hunting bands were attacked before reaching the Yellowstone. Another, a war party, returned with nothing but stories, and one blood-soaked parfleche filled with musket balls. The land was changing. The animals moved differently. Trails were worn where none had been before. Smoke rose from new directions. Iron tools replaced stone. Words like contract, alliance, and shipment became part of conversations once reserved for prophecy and prayer. And still, the Crow held their ground, not with fort walls or treaties, but with flexibility. They made deals, broke others, shifted allegiances as needed. They sent envoys to distant forts, negotiated access to trade goods, and even played French, American, and British interests against one another when it served them. This wasn't betrayal. It was survival, on their terms. Chief Longhair, a voice of cunning and vision, once told a trapper, "Your words are like rivers. They move with the season. Ours are like stone, placed carefully, one atop another. If we build wrongly, we fall." By the mid-1800s, that wall of stone was being tested. More settlers, more forts, more diseases, smallpox, measles, cholera, brought without warning and without cure. With every wagon that cut across the plains, the old world of the Crow narrowed. Not overnight, not all at once, but steadily, like erosion wearing down even the strongest bluff. And yet, through it all, the Crow remained. Battered, yes, but still standing. They rode between two worlds, never fully accepted by the newcomers, never truly understood by their enemies. But their story was not of submission. It was of navigation, through smoke, through trade, through fire. They were warriors who now carried rifles, diplomats who still counted coup, nomads who remembered every trail, even the ones now buried under iron and dust. For a moment in time, they balanced on the knife's edge between the old world and the new. And though the smoke of change drifted ever closer, the Crow still watched the horizon, still rode with the wind, still listened to the land beneath their feet. Because even if everything else shifted, that was something no trader, no treaty, no rifle could take from them. The war drums had not gone silent. They had simply changed rhythm. By the late 1800s, the winds of the northern plains carried new sounds: the clink of boot heels on stone, the snap of canvas tents in federal camps, the grind of wagon wheels etched deep into ancestral earth. The enemies of the Crow, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux, had grown stronger, more united, and far more desperate. The bison herds were thinning, trade routes were changing, and the land, always sacred, had become a battlefield not just between tribes, but between worlds. And in this storm, the Crow made a decision that would echo for generations. They chose to ride with the Blue Coats. To outsiders, it looked like betrayal. A native nation siding with the very army that was tearing down others. But to the Crow, this wasn't surrender. It was strategy. For nearly a century, the Crow had been under siege, not from settlers, but from their tribal enemies. The Lakota had pushed westward with fierce aggression, seizing hunting grounds once rich with buffalo and staking claims on the sacred lands of the Apsayaluki. The Cheyenne had burned Crow camps, stolen horses, and taken scalps along the Musselshell and Yellowstone. The Blackfeet remained a threat from the north, their riders fast and merciless. Every ridge held risk. Every river crossing could be a trap. So when the US military came asking for allies, guides, scouts, interpreters, the Crow did not see invaders. They saw an opportunity, a way to fight not alone. Chief Plenty Coups, not yet 20 years old, had already seen the writing in the smoke. As a boy, he experienced a vision during a fast, a tree struck down by a storm, its branches scattered, and in the distance, a strange bird building its nest in the wreckage. Elders interpreted it as a warning. The white man would take the land, whether welcomed or resisted. The tree was the Crow Nation, and if they wished to survive the storm, they must plant new roots carefully. It was a bitter truth, but it was truth nonetheless. In 1876, that truth came riding hard and fast across the dry prairie under a summer sun, when the US Army prepared for a campaign that would etch the words Little Bighorn into history. And with them rode Crow scouts, men who knew every bluff, every waterhole, every silent canyon in the land the army was about to enter. Among them were Curly, White Man Runs Him, and Hairy Moccasin, warriors who had traded their feathers for fringed jackets, their stone-tipped arrows for carbines, and their war cries for quiet warnings passed between soldiers who barely understood them. But they rode anyway. Because what lay on the other side of that ridge wasn't just another army. It was the largest gathering of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors the plains had ever seen. It wasn't loyalty to the US government that drove the Crow to ride that trail. It was memory. Memory of burned lodges, of stolen daughters, of fields once full of buffalo now patrolled by enemies. For the Crow, Custer's war wasn't a white man's war. It was their revenge, made legal by circumstance. The Battle of the Rosebud came first, June 17th, 1876. It was a clash of chaos and confusion. General George Crook led the US forces northward through Montana Territory, unaware that nearly 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne lay in wait. As the first shots rang out, it was Crow and Shoshone scouts who bore the brunt of the ambush. They fought with everything they had, rifles cracking, horses shrieking, arrows flying like summer hail. Crow scout, half-yellow face, later said, "We fought with our teeth and our blood. The white men fired bullets. We fired memory. The Rosebud was a tactical draw." But it delayed the army long enough for the Lakota under Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse to gather more strength. The Crow scouts knew what that meant. Time was slipping. War was boiling. 8 days later, Custer charged into the valley of the Little Bighorn. By then, the Crow scouts had warned him. They had seen the camps, dozens of lodges stretching like a village of spirits across the plain. They had seen smoke, heard drums, felt the tension in the air. And they had told him, "Do not go in. Not yet. Not like this." But Custer didn't listen. He trusted his instincts more than his guides. And so the Crow watched, helpless, as he and more than 260 men rode to their deaths. Some scouts followed for a time, shadowing the flanks, searching for wounded, marking paths of escape. Others turned back. They knew what would come. The circle closing, the thunder of hooves, the blood-soaked silence that would settle when the guns stopped. When it was over, they did not celebrate. The Lakota had won the day, but the tide of history did not turn with them. It turned with the iron rail, with the eastward telegraph, with Washington's revenge. And the Crow, for all their controversy, had chosen the side that would endure. Plenty Coups would later explain it simply. We did not fight with the white man. We fought for ourselves, so that when the storms passed, there would be something left of us to remember. That choice to ally with the Blue Coats bought the Crow time to secure a reservation, to hold on to a portion of their sacred land, to preserve pieces of their language, their rituals, their identity. While others were forced to Oklahoma or the Dakotas, the Crow remained near the Bighorns, near their stories. But it came with a cost. Other tribes saw them as traitors. Even today, some still speak of the Crow's role at Little Bighorn with bitterness. They were painted as collaborators, opportunists. But that view is too simple, too narrow. The truth is more complex. The Crow were not surrendering to a foreign empire. They were outmaneuvering an old enemy. They were using one invader to fend off another. And in that bloody chessboard of empire and erasure, they carved out a place, however fragile, for themselves. It was not victory. It was preservation. Today, the names of those scouts are etched in granite outside battlefield museums. Their faces appear in old daguerreotypes, stoic, proud, uncertain. And the descendants of Plenty Coup still tell the story of the storm, the broken tree, and the strange bird that built its nest in its branches. History doesn't always offer heroes or villains. Sometimes it only offers choices, hard ones, made with trembling hands and blood-stained earth. The Crow chose survival, and in doing so, they secured not just a future, but a voice. One that still echoes in the canyons of Montana, still rides the wind over the plains, still whispers from beneath the feathers of a war bonnet, placed not for glory, but for endurance. They had always moved with the rhythm of the land, following the buffalo, listening to the wind across the bighorns, drawing life from rivers that had no beginning and no end. For centuries, the Upsialuk called it home, the Yellowstone River Basin, where the soil was rich with memory, and every bend of the water held the footprint of a story. But by the 1870s, that rhythm had begun to break. The white man came with fences, deeds, and the quiet violence of paper, not with war cries or painted faces, but with ink and law. The US government had spoken in promises. They had sworn that treaties would protect Crow lands, that the river valleys and mountain trails would remain theirs. But those treaties, like the winter sun, vanished too quickly. Every map drawn in Washington erased something sacred. Every railroad that crept westward sliced through ancestral trails. What was once homeland became real estate. And the Crow, proud and adaptive, were forced to reckon with a new kind of siege. One fought not with rifles and horses, but with signatures and surveyor chains. The 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty had promised the Crow nearly 38 million acres. 20 years later, that promise was gone, renegotiated, reduced, again and again. By 1880, what remained was barely a fifth of what once was theirs. The government called it a reservation, a sanctuary, a place to civilize and protect. But to many Crow elders, it felt more like a cage. The buffalo were gone. The open hunts ended. Raiding, the right of warriors, had been outlawed. The songs changed. The old ways, whispered around fires and in shadow, were now forbidden in schools built by missionaries who called their language a sin. And yet, the spirit of resistance did not fade. It simply changed shape. Some of that resistance lived in the courts, others in silence, still others in the smallest acts of memory, a feather worn backwards, a story told in secret, a child named in the old way. Chief Plenty Coups, now older, wiser, and hardened by the ache of lost land, walked both worlds. He traveled to Washington, spoke before Congress, shook hands with men who'd never heard the wind move through tall grass. He told them plainly, "Education is good, but we do not want our children to lose our ways. The land is ours. It is our mother." But even he knew. To protect the future, they would have to plant it differently. So the Crow began to adapt. They turned their skill with horses, once a tool of war, into a foundation for trade. They bred, raised, and sold some of the finest horses in the territory. Even white settlers, who once feared the thunder of hooves coming over a ridge, now came to Crow ranchers to buy. They formed councils, governing themselves, even as outsiders tried to impose their laws. They held ceremonies away from the agent's gaze. They carved their language into the memories of their children, taught them the names of the stars and the scent of storms before they were taught to read. Kinship became survival. Even as land shrank, families remained connected across miles of open sky. A Crow grandmother might live in a log cabin on the edge of the Big Horn, her niece in a government-built frame house near Pryor, but they would still share stories, food, and the old songs passed down like flint blades, sharp, hidden, precious. The threat was everywhere, masked in kindness, dressed in uniforms, veiled in policy. Assimilation programs sent Crow boys to boarding schools where their braids were cut, their names replaced with English ones, and their thoughts reshaped by harsh discipline. Some came back broken, others came back quiet but unbent, carrying the old ways in their hearts like smouldering coals. Rebellion didn't always look like war. Sometimes it looked like refusal. A man named Stands in Red refused to send his children away. When the agent threatened to cut off rations, he simply hunted, illegally, quietly, one deer at a time. When confronted, he only said, "My children will learn Crow first. If they starve doing it, then the fault is not mine." Others rebelled in more subtle ways, by marrying in the old tradition rather than through church ceremony, by painting horses for ceremonial rides even when forbidden, by dancing when the drums were supposed to be silent. Some chose survival through cooperation, serving as police, scouts, or translators, believing that to bend was not to break. Some became interpreters between two worlds, speaking both the language of Congress and the language of the stars, and the land. The land remembered. Even as barbed wire fenced off sacred places, even as mines were dug into hills once used for fasting and prayer, the Crow still walked those paths, still buried their dead facing the sunrise, still believed that the spirits of their ancestors had not been evicted by law or line. By the turn of the century, the Crow were no longer warriors in the traditional sense, but they were warriors in spirit, in how they endured, how they adapted, how they refused to vanish. Their reservation, though a shadow of what once was, remained one of the last in Montana still anchored in original territory. Unlike many tribes, they had never been fully removed. That was not accident. That was intention. It was strategy. It was love. It was a battle fought not with bows or rifles, but with memory, negotiation, an unyielding heart. Today, the Yellowstone flows as it always has, sometimes gentle, sometimes wild. The cottonwoods still sway. The bones of old lodges still rest beneath the grass. And in the wind, if you listen closely, you can still hear the voices of those who fought for every inch of that earth. They did not win every battle, but they won the right to remain. And that is a victory carved deeper than any treaty, written not on paper, but into the land itself. The boy was barely 9 when the vision came. Alone on a wind-swept ridge above the Pryor Mountains, his belly empty from fasting, his eyes raw from staring into the sun, he lay in the dust of his ancestors, waiting. Waiting, as his people had for centuries, for the dream that would shape his path. He did not yet know that the world he was born into was already unraveling. He only knew the wind, the earth beneath his back, the silence before the spirits spoke. And then it came. The buffalo, the lifeblood of his people, fell, one after another, until the herds were gone, and the prairie was still. Then, from the empty grasslands, a new creature appeared. Small, grey, quick-eyed. The chickadee. That vision, quiet and strange, would shape everything Chief Plenty Coups would become. He would later say, "The buffalo is gone," and with it, the old ways. But the chickadee survives, not by strength, but by listening, by learning, by watching all things. And so, Plenty Coup, whose very name means many achievements, stepped into a storm of fire and steel armed not with weapons, but with wisdom. He would become the last great chief of a sovereign Crow nation, and the first to walk the halls of Washington, D.C., not as a prisoner, but as a diplomat. He was born in 1848, in a time of tightening circles. The Great Plains were shrinking. Railroads carved scars across hunting grounds. Settlers multiplied like ants in spring, their plows turning sacred soil into straight lines. The buffalo herds were thinning, hunted not for survival, but for sport, for profit, for industry. The rifle replaced the bow. The agent replaced the medicine man. The reservation replaced the horizon. And in the middle of this collapse, the Crow looked to Plenty Coups. He was no war chief in the old mold, though he had earned honors in battle. He counted coup on enemies. He rode through fire and thunder. But what made him a leader was not how he fought, but how he thought. He carried the chickadee's spirit into every council fire. He watched. He listened. He adapted. In 1880, as the US government pushed harder to divide and allot tribal lands, Plenty Coups stood before agents with eyes sharp as flint and refused to sign blindly. He demanded clarity, protection, respect. He negotiated with a mind honed on strategy and survival. And when his people were offered allotments, parcels of land meant to erase communal identity, he urged them not to take them blindly, but to use them as footholds, not surrender, but anchor. The world was changing, and Plenty Coups understood one truth more deeply than most. To survive the flood, you must sometimes float on the debris of the old world. He traveled east, more than once, representing the Crow in Washington and in national councils. Dressed in a long wool coat, his braids tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, he stood before lawmakers and presidents and reminded them that the treaties they signed were not just ink on paper, but sacred bonds watched by the ancestors. He spoke with dignity, with pride, but never with anger, because he knew that anger burned bridges, and bridges were needed now more than ever. In 1921, something extraordinary happened. Plenty Coups, then in his 70s, was invited to speak at the dedication of the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. It was a national moment, draped in flags and silence. And there, on behalf of all Native American tribes, this man from the windswept plains of Montana stood before thousands in the capital of a country that had tried to erase his people. He walked solemnly to the tomb, removed his headdress, and placed it gently on the stone. Then he said simply, "I am glad to represent my people at this sacred moment. I hope that the Great Spirit will grant strength and wisdom to all who come here." It was not a speech of grievance. It was a prayer of presence. Because Plenty Coups knew what others did not. The greatest act of resistance was to remain, to still be here, to still speak the language, to still raise children in the old ways, even as the world tried to forget you. He understood that heroism did not always come with a rifle. Sometimes it came with patience, with memory, with planting corn on broken ground, with telling stories when the lights were out and the agent was gone. He believed the Crow must not live in the past, but carry the past like fire in the palm of the hand. Enough to warm, not to burn. Enough to light the way forward. Under his leadership, the Crow did what few tribes managed. They kept their land, not all of it, not what was once theirs, but enough to breathe, to remember, to rebuild. He knew what it meant to live between two worlds, and he taught his people to walk that path with balance, to take what was useful and leave what was poison, to wear the suit in Washington, but speak the language of the ancestors at home. When Plenty Coups died in 1932, a nation mourned. Flags were lowered, columns were written. But in the high country of Montana, something quieter happened. A pipe was passed. A song was sung. A story was told about a boy on a ridge who saw the end of the world and chose to live. And today, the land still whispers his name. The chickadee still sings in the cottonwoods, and the crow still endure. Not just because of what they fought for, but because of what they listened to, what they adapted to, what they held on to. And because one man, once just a hungry boy staring into the sun, taught them that even when the buffalo fall, the spirit can still fly. Even in silence, even in sorrow, even in the storm. They came in wagons at first, later in iron trains, wearing polished boots and carrying clipboards instead of rifles. But to the crow, these men were warriors of another kind. Their weapons were not bullets. Their assault came dressed as kindness, cloaked in discipline, and carried out under the name of civilization. It was the early 20th century, and the war for the soul of Native America had entered a new phase, one not fought on battlefields, but in classrooms. Across the plains, the federal government built boarding schools like forts, red brick buildings with high windows and locked doors, names like Carlisle, Kamawa, Haskell. And the mission was clear: kill the Indian, save the man. Those were the words of Captain Richard Pratt, who founded the boarding school system. His goal was not extermination, it was erasure. And the Crow were not spared. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families, sometimes coerced, sometimes tricked, sometimes by force. Mothers wept. Fathers stood in silence as their sons were loaded into wagons, as daughters clutched handmade dolls stitched from old cloth and sinew, unaware that they would not return the same. At the schools, their hair was cut. Long braids, full of meaning and memory, fell to the floor like rope severed from history. Their moccasins were taken, their clothes burned. English was the only language allowed, spoken in stiff syllables and reinforced with wooden paddles. A Crow child caught speaking their own name could be beaten, forced to scrub floors, or locked in isolation for days. The girls were taught to sew, to iron, to scrub, to sit straight and still, to become maids in white households. The boys were taught drills, farming, carpentry, to take their hands off the bow and place them on the plough. Religion was mandatory. Catholic hymns replaced sweat lodge songs. The pipe was outlawed. Ceremonial dances declared heathen, and the drum, the heartbeat of a people, was silenced. But what could not be beaten out, shamed out, or prayed out was memory. Because even in those long corridors lined with fear, the Crow spirit refused to die. It survived in whispers, in older students who taught younger ones their native words after dark, huddled under coarse wool blankets, in lullabies hummed quietly at night, songs their mothers once sang beneath stars now hidden by barred windows, in dreams where buffalo still roamed and the rivers still sang their names. It survived in the eyes, the way a girl's gaze lingered on a hawk flying past the schoolyard, remembering how her grandfather said the bird carried prayers between worlds, or in a boy's clenched fists as he learned carpentry, not for wages, but to one day build a lodge where his people could gather in secret. Even the priests couldn't see the war being fought beneath the surface. One child, little Raven, once carved a small tobacco pipe from discarded wood scraps behind the school. He kept it hidden in a hollow tree near the edge of the grounds. Every full moon, he would sneak out, light dry grass in the bowl, and whisper his ancestors' names into the smoke. When he was caught, they broke the pipe in front of the other children and whipped him. But he remembered, and years later he would carve another and teach his own grandchildren how to hold it with reverence. This was resistance, not loud, not bloody, but unbreakable. And at home, the resistance never stopped. Crow mothers, denied their children for months or years, would prepare bundles for their return. Bits of sweetgrass, tiny beaded pouches, songs wrapped in silence. When their children came home ashamed of their language, they taught it back to them with patience, not in public, but in the kitchen, around the fire, in stories whispered like secrets. Fathers taught boys to ride again, to hunt rabbits in the hills with slings and snares, to read tracts, not just books. They called it remembering, because to forget was to lose the fight. Some elders never stepped foot on school grounds again. They believed the land itself would heal what the walls had scarred, so they gathered children for fasts, for vision walks. They placed their hands in the soil and reminded them, this is who you are, not what they made you. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Those songs, the ones sung under breath in the dormitories, survived. The language, pushed to the margins, was carried forward in fragments, then pieced together. Ceremonies returned, secret at first, then more open as laws changed. By the 1930s, change stirred again. The Merriam Report, a government study, condemned boarding schools for their cruelty. Reformers began to question the assimilation model. Some schools closed, others softened, but the damage was done. Generations had grown up with the scars of silence, lost between two worlds, not fully white, but no longer fluent in their own traditions. Still, the Crow endured. They established community schools on the reservation, taught history from their own viewpoint. Elders became teachers. Ceremonial knowledge was brought out of hiding. Language classes began. The old songs were sung again, not in secret, but in ceremony. And always, always, the memory of resistance remained. One elder put it simply, they took our children, but not our spirit. That was never theirs to keep. Today, Crow youth wear regalia at powwows, stitched with modern pride and ancient symbolism. Their braids are long again. Their words are strong. They dance in circles that were once forbidden, under the eyes of ancestors who never gave up. The scars of the boarding school era are real. They live in trauma, in broken families, in echoes of pain. But they also live in the stories passed down, in survival. The Crow story is not just about loss, it's about refusal. Refusal to vanish, refusal to forget, refusal to become what someone else demanded they be, even when stripped of their land, their language, their tools, their buffalo robes, their names. The Crow spirit held on, in smoke, in song, in the quiet corners of memory where no one else thought to look. And from that silence, it rose again, not as a shout, but as a whisper that would never stop echoing. In the soft blue dawn of a late summer morning, the sound of hooves echoes across the grasslands once more. Dust kicks up under the gallop of painted horses, their riders dressed in beadwork bright as flame, feathers lifting with the wind. A boy no older than 10 rides bareback, face steady, hands loose on the mane. Behind him, a line of crow riders stretches like a memory reborn, not in war, not in flight, but in celebration. This is not the 1800s. It is the Crow Fair in the heart of the 20th century. And after generations of erasure, this thunder of hooves, this blaze of color, this unity of motion, is the sound of return. The horse had always been more than a tool to the crow. It was a relative, a symbol of freedom, of prestige, of survival. In the centuries before the reservation lines were drawn, it was the horse that carried the Apsaluke across hundreds of miles of bison trails, through snowstorms and warfare, into ceremony and song. The horse was the drumbeat beneath their world. But after the land was cut, after the buffalo disappeared, after children were taken to schools that mocked the old ways, that heartbeat fell silent. And yet, it never stopped entirely. In the quiet corners of the reservation, In fenced pastures and dry ravines, the crow kept riding. Elders passed down what they remembered: the feel of a wild horse under you, the way to train without breaking spirit, how to ride not on the land, but with it. Through the middle decades of the 20th century, a cultural reawakening stirred. It wasn't loud. It didn't come from government grants or speeches. It came from grandmothers humming old riding songs, from uncles teaching nephews to braid manes the old way, from a worn saddle passed down through 5 hands. And then something powerful happened. Young crow people, those who had never hunted buffalo, who spoke English in school, who wore jeans and sneakers, began to feel the pull of something older, something buried but never dead. They came back to the horse, and in doing so, they came back to themselves. The Crow Fair, once a modest gathering, blossomed into a full-blown declaration of cultural survival. Each August, the valley near Crow Agency filled with teepees, not as props, but as living homes, painted in family colors, stitched with lineage. The horse parade, stretching across miles of earth, became a sacred procession. Here, fathers rode beside daughters. War veterans dressed in regalia that honored both their tribal past and their service in the US military. Young men galloped in full feathered headdresses, their faces painted in geometric prayers. Women, draped in elk-tooth dresses, rode side-saddle with grace that spoke of 1,000 years of memory. Each rider was a verse in a song of and continuance. But this revival was not just for show. It was work. It was training. It was sweat and dust and calloused hands. In summer camps set against the backdrop of the bighorns, elders taught the next generation what the boarding schools had tried to erase: how to read a horse's ears like a compass, how to mount from either side, how to trust without reins. They taught fire starting with flint and steel, water finding from grass color, how to build parfleche packs and cook with hot stones buried in earth. The wilderness, once a source of fear for the civilized, became classroom and church. Young riders learned how to carry a pipe, how to fast during vision quests, how to ride with silence and intention, because the horse listened not to words, but to breath. They learned to braid not just leather, but history. Elders told them, "This land will not speak to you in English. You must listen in Crow language too," became central to the revival. At first, it came in fragments: a word shouted during a race, a blessing muttered over a campfire. But over time, it grew. Schools on the reservation began offering immersion classes. Elders recorded themselves telling old stories of Coyote, of the Great Flood, of the first horses to come in dreams. For the crow, reclaiming the horse was reclaiming identity, and with it came pride. Not the soft pride of nostalgia, but the sharp pride of resilience. The knowledge that what had once been nearly lost had returned, not as relic, but as rhythm. Crow children began dreaming in their own language again. They wore beadwork not as costume, but as armor. They raised colts with the same care their ancestors once gave to war ponies. Their feet found old trails. Their spirits found balance. There were still struggles, poverty, disconnection. The legacy of trauma never disappears cleanly. But now, those struggles had a counterweight, a reminder, a path forward that did not require forgetting the past. One elder put it this way: "We were not meant to survive, not in their eyes, but every time that boy rides past on a painted horse, we prove them wrong again." And he was right, because in the eyes of the young, there is a fire now. In the pulse of hooves against the dirt, there is a drumbeat. In every sunrise that breaks over the Crow Reservation, there is a promise that even after silence, after loss, after generations of forgetting, a people can remember. A horse can return. A nation can be reborn. There are words that hold rivers, words that carry the shape of mountains, the rhythm of a horse's gallop, the flicker of firelight inside a sweat lodge. And there are words that, when spoken aloud, do not just describe the world, they become it. For the Crow people, their language, Apsaluka, is not just a system of speech. It is the breath of the ancestors, woven into every story, every ceremony, every footprint left in the dust of the Yellowstone Valley. It is how a child once knew when to plant, when to fast, when to ride toward war, and when to dream. But by the end of the 20th century, the voice of that world had almost gone silent. Less than 24 fluent speakers remained. Most were elders, their hair silvered by time, their memories filled with songs no one else remembered the tune to. Their children had been raised in English-speaking schools, and their grandchildren, raised on television and textbooks, now stood on a cliff's edge, the language beneath them crumbling like dry sandstone. It did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, word by word, as generations passed through boarding schools and church missions, where English was required and Crow was punished, where progress meant forgetting the old tongue. One elder, Josephine Plainfeather, once said, "When we stop speaking our words, the spirits go quiet." The land listens in English, but it does not answer. And for years, the land was quiet. But just as the plains can lie still before a storm, so too did the silence hide something deeper: resistance. It began, as many rebirths do, with listening. In the early 2000s, community leaders, educators, and surviving fluent speakers came together not to mourn the language, but to fight for it. Their tools weren't rifles or shields, but cassette recorders, flashcards, whiteboards, and patience. They gathered in kitchens, in tribal offices, in school gymnasiums. They recorded old speakers, not just vocabulary lists, but stories, myths, prayers, lullabies sung to babies wrapped in rabbit skin. They documented not just how the Crow spoke, but how they thought. Because to speak Crow is to live in a different dimension of reality, one where time bends differently, one where relationships are encoded into every verb, where animals and places are not things, but relatives. In English, you say, "the river flows." In Crow, the river is alive and choosing to flow. To save the language meant not just memorizing words, but recovering an entire way of seeing. And so they built schools, Crow-only immersion schools, where preschoolers learned colors, numbers, and directions in the tongue of their great-grandparents, where classroom walls bore the old script, and elders sat in circles with children, teaching through song and repetition. In one such school, a boy named Michael was asked to name the parts of a horse, not in English, but in Crow. He faltered, unsure, then slowly formed the words his grandfather had once used on the open range. His voice cracked, but the elders smiled. It was the first time in 30 years they had heard those words from someone so young. Elsewhere, digital projects sprang to life. Phone apps, online dictionaries, video recordings of fluent speakers translating common phrases. Young people began texting each other in Crow. A language once whispered became typed, shared, spoken, again. Language camps were held each summer. Families gathered on ancestral land to learn in the open air, around fires, beside rivers, under stars. Elders taught how to greet the dawn, how to call to a horse, how to tell a joke in the old tongue. Children laughed. Parents stumbled over grammar, but the sound of the language returned to the wind. And the wind, it seemed, remembered. Some tribes lose their language and survive, but survival is not the same as continuance. Without language, identity blurs. Ceremony becomes mimicry. Land becomes property. Memory becomes history. Distant, academic, dead. But the Crow refused to let that happen. One teacher, Thomas Spotted Elk, stood in front of his class and held up a photograph of his grandmother. He said, "She only knew Crow, but she could see farther than anyone I've ever met. She didn't need a map. She was the map. When I speak her words, I remember the path. Every sentence, every recovered phrase is an act of re-anchoring, a declaration, we are still here, we are still us, And in that process, the language itself evolved. New words were created for airplanes, for phones, for cities, but they were shaped in the old way, through metaphor, through story. A helicopter became the buzzing bird that never lands, a computer, the box that remembers everything. These were not just translations, they were transformations, because the goal was not to mimic English. The goal was to let the Crow worldview rise again, like smoke from a rekindled fire. Today, the movement is growing. Teenagers rap in Crow. Radio stations run morning announcements in the language. Ceremonies are once again conducted entirely in the old tongue. And in homes across the reservation, parents are raising children who will speak Crow as their first language, something that hasn't happened in over 100 years. This is more than revival. It is inheritance reclaimed. The Crow know that language is not just about words. It is about breath, about presence, about placing yourself inside the same current that carried your ancestors. To say Bapila, thank you, is to speak with the same syllables uttered by warriors beside the Little Bighorn, by grandmothers weaving baskets, by children born in tipis beneath comet-lit skies. To speak Crow today is to undo erasure, to call back what was stolen, to make the land answer again. And so, as the sun sets behind the Bighorn Mountains and a child recites their first full sentence in Apsailuk, beneath the rustling of cottonwood leaves, something sacred happens. The land hears, and this time it answers. Beneath the wide skies of Montana, where the wind still hums the same ancient songs it carried centuries ago, the Crow Nation rises each morning not as a relic, not as survivors, but as sovereigns. The buffalo are gone, the treaties broken, the scars of boarding schools and lost language still run deep. Yet in the shadows of the Bighorn Mountains, on lands once hunted, bled for and danced upon, the descendants of the Apsaluka still walk with their heads high, not just remembering the old ways, but living them, adapting them, guarding them like sacred fire. This is the story of a people who never left. In the heart of the Crow Reservation, today's tribal government stands as both a shield and a compass. Crow leaders, elected by their own, manage not just lands and resources, but memory and future. Sovereignty is not symbolic, it is fought for every day. In water negotiations with federal agencies, in courtrooms where pipelines threaten sacred sites, in policy rooms where the air grows thin with jargon, but the stakes remain deeply rooted in the soil. Leaders like Cedric Black Eagle, or the women rising in political council seats, don't just quote law, they quote prophecy. They remind the world that long before borders and counties and congressional districts, there was a land tied to a people and a people tied to a vision. And it is that vision, sacred, gritty, and evolving, that fuels the Crow in the 21st century. Across the reservation, a new generation is being raised in two worlds, one of screens and smartphones, and one of sweat lodges, sundance ceremonies, and tribal drums echoing through the twilight. In classrooms built not far from where their great-grandfathers once rode in war paint, Crow youth are learning math and science, but also horse care, native botany, and survival tracking. They're taught how to interpret Google Maps, but also how to read the movement of birds, the curl of grass, the bend of cottonwood limbs before a storm. This is what their elders called dual medicine, to walk in the modern world without forgetting the ancient one. Youth programs across the Crow Nation now teach more than leadership and literacy. They teach fire starting, songkeeping, the construction of sweat lodges, the etiquette of offering tobacco, how to speak with humility, how to pray with cedar, how to carry yourself like a crow, not with pride alone, but with purpose. Every summer, at the Crow Fair, this purpose rides again. What began as a modest gathering over a century ago has become one of the largest native celebrations in the country. Families erect over 1,000 teepees in a massive encampment, each telling a story of kinship and continuity. Parades flow with the vibrant colour of beadwork, with horses groomed like royalty, riders moving with elegance and discipline, the kind only passed down through generations. At night, the powwow grounds come alive. Drums pound like thunder against the earth, songs rise from voices that once were silenced. Children dance beside elders, veterans carry flags alongside eagle staffs. The past and present twirl together in regalia that glitters under floodlights. A reminder that this isn't just ceremony, it's a declaration. We are still here. But being here is not without battle. The Crow continue to face threats to their land and water. Coal mining, once a source of tribal revenue, now weighs against the urgency of environmental stewardship. Rivers that once ran clean now carry the sediment of modern industry. Sacred hills risk desecration in the name of energy. And so the Crow fight, not with spears, but with legal petitions, with alliances, with science and ceremony. Young environmental activists, fluent in both ecological data and tribal tradition, now stand at the forefront of resistance. They speak before panels, invoking not just emissions charts, but the stories of sacred springs, the burial grounds of ancestors, the songs sung to the rivers at sunrise. They are not just saving land, they are saving meaning. And through it all, the spiritual lifeblood of the Crow continues to flow. Ceremonial bundles are still passed down with reverence. Pipe carriers still sit in the early morning mist, offering prayers for health, for guidance, for survival. Vision quests still happen on sacred ridges, where a young person fasts, cries, listens, and perhaps, like Plenty Coups before them, sees a vision that will guide a people through another century of change. It is here, in this quiet endurance, that the Crow story finds its most powerful note. Not in victories measured by territory regained or dollars secured, but in the simple act of continuity. A mother rocking her baby to sleep in Crow. A teenager learning how to craft a bow the way her great-great-grandfather once did. A community gathering to build a sweat lodge. Not for tourists, not for display, but because the spirit still calls for it. They are not ghosts clinging to the past. They are torchbearers, carrying an old light forward into new storms. In 1909, Chief Plenty Coups spoke these words at the dedication of the tomb of the unknown soldier in Washington, D.C. "I feel that I can truly represent my people, for they too fought for this country." He laid down his war bonnet and coup stick, not in surrender, but in witness, in continuity, and over a century later, that same spirit lives on in the Crow of today. They still ride, they still sing, they still speak, they still fight for land, for language, for breath. And when the wind rushes across the plains, brushing the tall grass and bending it gently toward the sunrise, it carries with it a quiet truth, not written in textbooks, not spoken in campaign speeches, but felt. The Crow are not a chapter in history, they are its continuation, a quiet, sacred breath that pulsed through the forests of the Great Lakes, a fire tended not only with cedar and flint, but with memory, with duty, and with an unbroken chain of human hands. They called themselves Anishinaabe, the original people. And among them stood the Potawatomi, the keepers of that fire. Long before white sails crossed the Atlantic, before iron rifles echoed in the woods, the Potawatomi lived as one with the land. Their world stretched across what we now call Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, a tapestry of waterways, black earth, sugar maple groves, and icy winters that tested even the hardiest. But the Potawatomi did not merely survive these wilds, they belonged to them. Their homes, wigwams, were low, dome-shaped shelters made from willow frames and birch bark, designed to breathe with the seasons. In summer, bark panels were lifted to cool the interior. In winter, layers of hides and woven mats held in the warmth of shared breath and burning embers. Inside, families gathered in circles, their stories spiraling up with the smoke. Outside, the forest was a vast storehouse, not just of food, but of meaning. In early spring, when snow still whispered beneath the trees, the Potawatomi tapped maple trees, collecting sap in birch bark containers. This was not just a harvest, it was a ceremony. Elders taught the young how to listen to the trees, how the sap ran like lifeblood, how nothing should be taken in greed, and how every act of survival was also an act of respect. They fished the lakes in canoes carved from birch and stitched with spruce roots, watercraft so light they could be lifted onto one shoulder, yet stable enough to glide silently across fog-draped rivers. Their paddles dipped like clockwork, often accompanied by quiet singing, a rhythm of labor and law. In the fall, they gathered wild rice, manumin, the food that grows on water. This too was sacred. They used wooden sticks to knock the rice into their canoes, careful not to damage the stalks, ensuring the beds would return next season. They dried it over fire, parched it in clay pots, and danced upon it in moccasins to remove the husk, a process as spiritual as it was practical. Theirs was a world of circles. Circles of family, circles of ceremony, circles of fire. Fire, to the Potawatomi, was not merely a tool, it was alive, a relative. They carried embers from one camp to the next in bark bundles or clamshells. They believed the sacred fire was a gift from the Creator, a divine heartbeat passed through generations. And within the ancient Three Fires Confederacy, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa, it was the Potawatomi who were entrusted to keep that fire lit. This alliance was more than politics, it was survival. The Odawa traded, the Ojibwe healed, the Potawatomi guarded the flame, spiritual and literal. In every camp, the firekeeper had a duty. He or she would rise before dawn, crouch beside the coals, and whisper prayers into the smoke. Cedar, tobacco, sweetgrass. Each offering cast to the flames carried a message to the unseen. They believed the smoke could cross into realms beyond human reach, speaking for the people when words failed. Their language, Bodowadmimwen, was a fluid, animistic tongue, where even a stone could be addressed with reverence, and every verb carried the weight of relation. One did not simply say, "I walk." One said, "I walk in connection with the land beneath me." Among the Potawatomi, no task was meaningless. The building of a canoe, the stretching of a deer hide, the carving of a paddle or bow. Each motion was part of a larger story. A boy did not just learn to set a snare. He learned where the rabbit would feel safest, what paths were likely after a snowfall, what kind of hunger moved a creature from one patch of brush to another. Survival was not about domination, it was about understanding. Children learned early. A 7-year-old might know the exact bark that could treat a fever, or how to find water when the snow refused to melt. Grandmothers passed on stories not with books, but by gesture, the motion of a hand, the flick of a glance toward a hidden symbol on a lodgepole. Their clan system was the thread that wove these teachings into something enduring. Each clan, bear, crane, loon, fish, marten, and more, carried responsibilities. Some governed, others mediated, some fought, some healed. It was a living structure of accountability, where identity wasn't chosen, but inherited, and every person had a place, a purpose, a path. And yet, in this intricate design, there was no hierarchy of power, no chiefs in the sense that settlers would later impose. Leadership among the Potawatomi was earned, never demanded. The strongest voices were often the quietest, those who had walked long roads, survived great winters, and chosen patience over pride. This humility was their strength. It's easy now to look back on this time through the cracked glass of modernity, to see their birch bark canoes as primitive, their stone tools as obsolete. But to live as they did, with nothing wasted, nothing taken without prayer, required a discipline far greater than comfort. Every winter brought real danger. Every season demanded labor, and yet they endured. They endured because their knowledge was rooted in memory, not written memory, living memory. Memory sung by women while grinding corn. memory etched into the designs of quillwork and tattoo. Memory passed beside firelight when snow blanketed the world outside, and all that remained was voice, story, and the promise of dawn. They called their homeland Risakodeweni, the land of the burnt grass, a name shaped not by conquest, but by observation. Even their name, Potawatomi, is a gift from others. It's a corruption of Bodewadmi, those who tend the fire. This, then, was their beginning, not of conquest, not of the empire, but of stewardship, of reciprocity, of survival bound to ceremony, to flame, to the belief that every act, no matter how small, echoes in the dark. As the centuries turned, that fire would be tested, scattered, hunted, nearly extinguished. But in this moment, in these woods, the fire still burns, quiet, sacred, waiting. By the time the white sails brushed the horizon of the Great Lakes, the Potawatomi were already a force woven deep into the land, not rulers of it, but defenders, interpreters, and stewards. They moved like water through the forests and across the rivers, paddling birch-bark canoes laced with spruce roots, guided not by maps, but by ancestral memory. But as the 1600s gave way to the 1700s, their world began to shift, not with the crash of thunder, but with a whisper through the trees, the whisper of trade and war. First came the French, their skin pale, their coats heavy with musk, their hands full of gifts, glass beads, iron tools, brass kettles, and the most transformative item of all, the flintlock musket. These newcomers came not with conquest, not yet, but with hunger. Hunger for furs. The fur trade became a new kind of wilderness. Not one walked with snowshoes, but one navigated with promises, debts, and the ever-clinking coins of French ports and British markets. The Potawatomi, ever keen observers of power, aligned early with the French, not out of loyalty, but strategy. The French treated them as trading partners rather than subjects. Jesuit priests came too, black robes sweeping through the villages with crosses and Latin prayers. Some Potawatomi welcomed them cautiously, others with suspicion. These men spoke of salvation, but often ignored the sacred fire, the clan spirits, and the ancient rhythms of drum and smoke. As the trade intensified, so did the bloodshed. The Beaver Wars, a savage contest for dominance of the fur trade, turned the forests of the Great Lakes into killing grounds. The Iroquois Confederacy, armed by the British, swept westward, burning villages, slaying rival hunters, and attempting to choke out competitors. The Potawatomi, alongside the Ojibwe and Odawa, resisted with desperate resilience. War parties painted their faces in ash and ochre, traveling at night, striking swift and vanishing into thickets and marsh. Every scalp taken was a message. Every village burned, a warning. There were no neutral grounds, no safe harbours. The tools of war now included French steel knives and British gunpowder, but the cost was measured not in bullets, but in children taken, in winters faced without food, in long silences where songs once lived. Still, the Potawatomi adapted. They built fortifications with sharpened palisades. Women guarded the fires while the men were gone for weeks at a time. Scouts moved like shadows across frozen lakes, reading tracks, watching smoke, counting how many lodges stood in enemy camps. When the French called, the Potawatomi answered. During the French and Indian War, they fought beside French soldiers against the advancing British. At Fort Duquesne, at Monongahela, at distant strongholds buried deep in the woods, Potawatomi warriors stalked red-coated infantry through fog and underbrush, their muskets loaded with care, their axes ready for the close fight. A British officer once wrote, "They descend upon us like the wind, and are gone before we can raise our bayonets. They fought not for France, but for the right to remain, but empires rise as quickly as they fall. In 1763, France ceded all its North American holdings to Britain, and the ground beneath the Potawatomi shifted again. Their allies were gone. Their villages, now under the watchful eyes of redcoat patrols. British traders lacked the tact of the French. They charged more for powder, demanded more pelts, offered less respect. And when they cut off the traditional gift-giving system, seen by tribes as a sacred part of alliance, it was not just an insult. It was war. In the wake of French defeat, a spiritual storm gathered in the West. A firebrand vision led by Pontiac, the Ottawa war chief. With passion and prophecy, he rallied tribes along the lakes and rivers, calling for the expulsion of the British. The Potawatomi answered again. They laid siege to Fort Detroit, attacking outposts, burning fields, testing the nerves of every redcoat who dared step beyond palisade walls. The fighting was brutal, personal. Skirmishes were waged in the thickets of cattails under moonlight, in silence. Pontiac's rebellion failed, but the message was heard. Still, no peace was true peace, because soon another storm would come. This one born not in the forests, but in the halls of Philadelphia. The American Revolution was not their war, yet it came anyway. To many native nations, it was a fight between two foreign powers, neither of whom could be trusted. The British, with whom they had fought and bled, and the American colonists, greedy for land, forever pushing past agreed borders, building homesteads where old hunting trails once ran. Again, the Potawatomi chose sides, mostly siding with the British. They believed, rightly or wrongly, that Britain might restrain American expansion. In truth, it was a gamble, and it came at a cost. In 1780, a combined force of Potawatomi, Shawnee, and British loyalists attacked the frontier town of St. Louis, hoping to blunt American expansion up the Mississippi. The attack failed. The retaliation was swift. American forces struck villages, razed crops, slaughtered those too old or too young to flee. A Potawatomi elder years later would say, "We tried to choose the lesser fire, but both burned." It was during these chaotic decades that Potawatomi diplomacy grew sharp. They sent emissaries across vast distances, to the Miami, the Kickapoo, the Winnebago, forging a regional resistance. Council fires burned deep into the night. Decisions were weighed with gravity. They debated treaties, trade routes, battle plans. A single misstep could doom generations. Their weapons were no longer just bows and guns. Their tools became words, alliances, and silence. Silence, when to say nothing to the British, when to withhold information from the Americans, when to speak only in a. They did not come with rifles this time, not with torches or axes, not with muskets gleaming in the dawn. This time, the weapon was paper. From 1795 to 1833, the Potawatomi found themselves trapped in a different kind of battlefield, one where the lines were inked in clauses, and the smoke didn't rise from burning lodges, but from sealing wax and pressed signatures. A war not of warriors and scouts, but of lawyers, land surveyors, and government agents, whose words cut deeper than steel. The treaties came in waves, relentless, confusing, and deliberate. The Treaty of Greenville, 1795, the first stone. Signed after defeat in the Ohio Indian Wars, it ceded a sliver of land in Ohio, barely a scratch, but it opened a door that would never close again. Then came the Treaty of Fort Wayne, 1803, another sliver gone, and again in 1809, and again in 1818, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. Bit by bit, the land was sliced away like flesh from bone, until only fragments remained. For the Potawatomi, these treaties were not agreements. They were ultimatums. Government interpreters, some well-meaning, others cold and corrupt, translated the terms loosely, often distorting key phrases. The Potawatomi, whose own language wrapped time and responsibility in sacred phrasing, found themselves cornered by English legalese that twisted meaning like a knot. Land cessions were described as temporary. Hunting rights promised in perpetuity were later dismissed as errors. A signature made by a leader was stretched to represent an entire band. There were no maps handed over, no clear boundaries, no appeals, just a line at the bottom of a page and a circle of white men nodding in satisfaction. Some chiefs signed under pressure, worn down by hunger, war, or exhaustion. Others resisted, vanishing into the woods or fleeing north to escape the inked trap closing around them. One elder, Chief Topinabee, once said, "They make us promises with their lips and steal from us with their hands." At treaty councils, gifts were offered: tobacco, beads, knives, and blankets. But these were not tokens of friendship. They were incentives, payment for silence, sugar to coat the poison. The Potawatomi began calling these meetings Black Wampum Councils, deals cloaked in diplomacy but soaked in betrayal. Survival, once measured in winters endured or hunts survived, was now measured in pages, in how much land remained unclaimed, and how long that line could be held. By the 1820s, even that hope began to fade. The Treaty of Chicago, signed in 1833, was the final blow. It was pitched as a fair deal, an exchange of land in Illinois and Wisconsin for promised lands west of the Mississippi, along with annuity payments and supplies. But the Treaty Council was a theater of pressure. White settlers loomed on the outskirts. Government agents made it clear: sign or be forgotten. One Potawatomi leader, Shabona, begged others not to agree. He had fought alongside the United States in previous wars. He believed in coexistence, but even he could see what was coming. Some chiefs were bribed, others were threatened. And when the treaty was finally signed, it marked the legal death of the Potawatomi homeland east of the Mississippi. The consequences were not just geographic, they were spiritual. The land was not simply property. It held burial grounds, sacred trees, and medicine trails. It held the footprints of ancestors and the whispered songs of countless winters. With every loss, a piece of memory was severed, a drumbeat silenced. When land was ceded, entire ways of life collapsed. Wigwams were replaced with uncertainty. Winter caches went untended. Children asked why their songs were no longer sung in the same places. Elders buried sacred bundles in the ground before leaving, unsure if they'd ever return. Even those who stayed, who tried to cling to the old ways in the shrinking patches of forest, found themselves surrounded by fences, roads, and the growing hum of settler towns. A Potawatomi woman named Minokwa, in her 70s, when forced from her home near the Fox River, remembered the day the treaty men came. They did not look at our faces, only the land beneath our feet. The trauma was not just political, it was deeply personal. Fathers found themselves unable to provide. Hunters faced game that had vanished or been driven off. Healers were mocked. Children were taken to boarding schools where their language was forbidden. If they spoke Bodewadmimwen, even to comfort one another, they were punished. One young boy, taken to a mission school near Fort Dearborn, carved his name in Potawatomi into the underside of his cot each night. It was the only place it could survive. For generations, the forest had given everything: food, shelter, spirit. Now it stood behind them like a grieving parent, watching its children vanish toward a horizon they could not return from. Yet even amid this sorrow, there were flickers of defiance. Some Potawatomi families fled north to Canada. Others disappeared into the interior, living quietly, hidden from census rolls and military patrols. They kept their names off treaties, refused annuity payments, vanished from record, but not from the land. They became shadows in their own homeland, ghosts that walked freely in forests now owned by strangers. And still, the paper trail grew longer. Over 30 treaties, dozens of clauses, thousands of square miles surrendered. Some documents bore names signed with an X, a mark made by hands that could not write in English, but carried entire histories in memory. Some were forged, others were misfiled, but all of them carried the same outcome: the erosion of everything the Potawatomi had called home. For the white men, it was law. For the Potawatomi, it was loss. A chief once asked a treaty negotiator, "Why do your words need so many pages, when our promise needs only our fire and our breath?" The answer, though never spoken, was clear. Because this was not about trust. It was about control. By 1833, that control was nearly complete. The forests of Indiana, the dunes of Lake Michigan, the prairies of Illinois, all of it now bore the weight of white settlement. Plows churned earth where sacred sites once stood. Railroad lines carved through old hunting paths. Towns with English names rose like monuments to amnesia. And the Potawatomi, once the fierce keepers of the sacred fire, now found themselves walking the edge of exile. What remained was not a battlefield, not even a graveyard. What remained was paper, and the path it carved would soon lead west. A new chapter was beginning, one that would not be written in ink, but in footsteps and blood, ceremony. They learned the enemy's language. Some learned to write, others studied maps, and a few quietly visited mission schools, not to become Christians, but to understand the mind of those who sought to conquer them. And yet, for all their skill, the tide was turning. By the late 1700s, settler roads cut deeper into native land. Log cabins appeared near rivers where birchbark canoes once floated. Fences divided the open hunting grounds. And those same settlers, many of whom had never seen a Potawatomi face, demanded protection from a people they were displacing. The Potawatomi had survived French intrigue, British betrayal, and American ambition. But survival came at a cost. Entire villages uprooted, sacred grounds forgotten or desecrated, children taken to be civilized, and a new weapon emerged: paper, treaties, legal chains, inked in English, often mistranslated, always slanted. They would come in time, those documents. They would promise protection, land, peace, and deliver the opposite. But even in this era of muskets and missionaries, one truth remained. The Potawatomi did not vanish. They watched. They endured. They chose their battles like hunters stalking prey, with patience, with silence, and with the slow gathering of power. Because for every musket fired, every village lost, every trail stained with grief, a fire still burned in the heart of the people, waiting, watching, planning. In the late summer of 1838, the land east of the Mississippi turned silent for the Potawatomi people. Not because their songs had faded, not because the sacred fires were cold, but because the feet that once danced on that earth were now ordered to leave it. By decree of the United States government, the Potawatomi were to be removed from their homelands in northern Indiana, marched west under military guard to what was then called the unorganized territory. A place unknown, a place barren of memory, a place they had never chosen. What followed was not a relocation, it was a death march. More than 850 Potawatomi, men, women, and children, were rounded up under threat of rifle and saber, their homes abandoned, their crops left to rot in the fields. There was no negotiation, no final ceremony, no time for mourning, only an order and the sound of boot heels pressing forward. They departed on September 4th, 1838, the beginning of a 660-mile journey from Twin Lakes, Indiana, to the edge of Kansas. 26 wagons carried the weakest, the very old, the sick, the infants. But most walked, every step torn from blistered feet, every night spent beneath cold canvas or open sky. Their leader, Chief Menominee, had refused to sign the treaty that claimed their land. He had spoken out at council fires, pleaded with officials, and vowed not to abandon the soil where his ancestors were buried. For this resistance, he was shackled in chains and dragged from his village, a leader turned prisoner, made to watch his people suffer from behind a wagon's barred door. He would never see Indiana again. The Potawatomi called the journey Nshwansing, the burning of the soul. Others would come to call it the Trail of Death. Father Benjamin Petit, a young French missionary who had come to serve the tribe, walked with them, journal in hand, heartbreaking beneath the weight of what he witnessed. Every day, he wrote, I see tears, blood, death. The children are dropping to the ground like leaves in the frost. By the second week, Dysentery had set in. Water was scarce, and what little they found was often tainted. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, feverish and limp. Some cried. Others could no longer find the strength to speak. One boy, no more than 5, collapsed near Logansport. His name was Piwa, which meant echo. He had once been known in his village for singing before sunrise. But on the trail, his voice vanished. He died in his mother's arms under a sycamore tree. She dug his grave with her own hands while soldiers looked away. By the 3rd week, the nights turned cold. Temperatures dipped below freezing. Grandmothers who once told stories by firelight now wrapped their legs in shredded blankets, trying to will heat into their bones. Some never woke up. The Potawatomi had no time to mourn their dead. Each morning, as the sun clawed over the horizon, the army demanded movement. The sick were lifted into wagons already crowded with the dying. The dead were buried hastily along the roadside, their graves marked by bent twigs or piles of stones, if at all. Often there was no wood to carve names, no time for prayers. Father Petit wrote again, "We are leaving behind not just bodies, but pieces of ourselves. These hills remember. This road bleeds." The soldiers weren't all cruel. Some shared rations. A few wept when children died. But they followed orders, and the orders were clear. Move them west. Do not stop. Each week brought more loss. By the time they reached Springfield, Illinois, over 20 people were dead. More than half were children. The roads were thick with mud. Rain turned paths into sludge. The horses were thin. Wagons broke down. The soldiers pushed them forward still, mile after mile, breath after breath. The sound of coughing replaced laughter. The smell of rot lingered in the blankets. And yet, within the nightmare, flickers of resistance remained. Each night, elders whispered the old songs. Mothers passed sacred bundles beneath tattered quilts. Warriors scouted ahead, watching for danger, shielding the weakest with their own bodies. Even shackled, Chief Menominee offered quiet prayers, eyes fixed on the horizon, lips moving with ancient words of endurance. There were no battles on this trail, no guns fired, no burning villages. But it was war just the same, a war of attrition, of weather, of grief, a war meant to erase a people not with swords, but with distance. At Peoria, they paused briefly. A Potawatomi woman named Nokomis, whose name meant grandmother, offered her last piece of dried venison to a girl who had not eaten in 3 days. She herself hadn't eaten in 2. That night, Nokomis died in her sleep. Her hand still closed around a piece of cedar bark she had carried from Indiana, believing it held the spirit of her homeland. By the end of the march, 61 souls were lost. The youngest was 8 months, the oldest, near 80. When they finally arrived at the banks of the Osage River in Kansas, it was November. Snow kissed the earth. The wind bit through worn-out moccasins. The land was open, endless and unfamiliar. There were no trees, no lakes, no familiar trails, only grass and silence, and graves stretching behind them like a second trail. Father Petit, ill from the journey, would not live long. He died shortly after the march ended, a broken man who had walked through the valley of shadows with a people he came to love. He had written, "I shall never forget them. They walked like ghosts." But within them burned the fire of those who refused to be forgotten. The United States called the march successful, but for the Potawatomi, it marked a wound that would never fully close, a scar carried in stories, in bloodlines, in memories whispered across generations. They buried their children far from home. They sang to the stars that no longer hung over their sacred lakes. They made fires on soil that did not know their names, and still they endured, because survival was not just in their blood, it was in their breath. In every prayer offered, beside a nameless grave, in every step taken with blistered feet, in every refusal to let go of the stories, the language, the names of the dead. The trail of death was not the end. It was a crucible. From it would rise a generation that remembered and refused to forget. And though the trail still cuts through cornfields and highways, the spirits walk with the wind. They do not ask for pity, only remembrance, and silence enough to hear their footsteps. The trail ended, but the struggle did not. In the winter of 1838, those Potawatomi who had survived the forced march stepped down from worn wagons and looked out across the rolling plains of eastern Kansas. A land that was not theirs, a land that spoke no memories and bore none of the ancient lakes, rivers, or forest trails they once called home. Here, on this unfamiliar soil, the government established a reservation, bounded by treaty, but unmarked by mercy. It was a space carved from promises already fraying, a holding place for a people stripped from their past, now expected to vanish into the winds of westward expansion. But the Potawatomi did not vanish. They adapted, they resisted, and they began again. At first, the reservation near the Kansas River was sparse. A few government buildings, a mission chapel, barracks for Indian agents, and a field where seed had barely taken root. Families who had once lived among sugar maple groves now tried to till clay-hard earth under a sky too wide, too empty. They dug wells. They built new wigwams, then log cabins. They grew corn, beans, squash, the Three Sisters, just as they always had, though the soil didn't carry the same taste, the same pulse. Some worked as laborers for nearby settlements. Others hunted what little game could still be found among the grasslands. But it wasn't survival that was most difficult. It was forgetting. The old songs, the language, the clan customs were all viewed now through a lens of suspicion. Missionaries arrived, Protestant, Catholic, Methodist, each claiming a spiritual path forward, each attempting to remake the Potawatomi in their own image. Children were gathered into schools where they were taught to recite prayers in Latin, to wear shoes and buttons, and to abandon their native tongue. The language, Bodewad Mimwen, was banned from the classroom. A child who once knelt beside a grandmother's fire to learn the names of rivers now knelt in pews, forced to call their creator by a foreign name. Those who refused were punished. A boy named Ashkibok, he who sees clearly, was tied to a post and whipped for speaking Potawatomi during a game of stickball. He was 10. That night, his father stood at the edge of the missionary compound, holding a drum. He did not sing, only beat it once for every lash his son had received. In the silence between each strike, the sound of resistance was deafening. The government called this assimilation, but for the Potawatomi, it was erasure, one word at a time. Still, even under the shadow of suppression, the fire smoldered. Secret ceremonies were held in the dark hours before dawn. The drum circle, the tobacco offering, the sweat lodge prayer, carried out not for show, but for survival. Mothers whispered old names to newborns. Elders etched clan symbols into walking sticks and firewood, knowing that even if their voices were silenced, memory would find another form. Then came allotment. Under the Dawes Act of 1887, the federal government shifted its approach. Instead of holding land communally, as the Potawatomi had always done, each individual was to receive a personal allotment, a plot of roughly 160 acres. On paper, it looked generous, but in reality, it was a trap. The remaining tribal land, what wasn't assigned to individuals, was declared surplus and sold off to white settlers. Thousands of acres vanished in ink. What remained was a checkerboard of private plots, some fenced, some sold, some swindled from those who didn't speak English well enough to read the contracts they were made to sign. Within a single generation, the land that had once been reserved for the nation became a patchwork quilt of broken promises. Families were divided, clans separated, hunting paths cut off by railways and barbed wire. A woman named Nodin, Wind, refused her allotment. She said, "I will not take land that cuts away my sisters." She lived instead along the riverbank, where she taught the youth how to fish with woven nets and how to boil cedar for fevers. Her name never appeared in federal records. But her stories live on. Despite the hardships, the hunger, the loss of language, the spiritual suppression, the Potawatomi found new ways to endure. They learned new farming methods, blending traditional knowledge with European plough techniques. They raised livestock. They organized cooperatives, seed exchanges, and community harvests. And more than that, they began to challenge the system. Young Potawatomi men began attending Indian boarding schools not to be assimilated, but to learn the language of power, to read law, to study maps, to understand the very tools that had been used against them. One such man, Louis Vieux, born in 1809 and educated both traditionally and in missionary schools, would become a trader, a landowner, and an advocate. He built a home on the reservation, employed both native and settler workers, and used his influence to push for tribal recognition and legal protections. He wasn't alone. The citizen Potawatomi, so called because of their early adoption of certain federal citizenship requirements, began building a movement. They knew they could no longer live solely as they had in Michigan or Indiana, but neither would they become relics of history. Instead, they would become builders. They established governments, courts, schools, and businesses. They wrote constitutions, forged alliances, and started to draft petitions to Washington. Petitions not of protest alone, but of purpose. They demanded the return of stolen funds, the protection of burial grounds, the right to govern themselves, not as a conquered people, but as a sovereign nation. And all the while, the ceremonies continued, no longer just in secret. By the turn of the century, some of the oldest songs returned to the light. Drums echoed again across the Kansas plains. Sacred fires were lit, not in defiance, but in celebration. A grandmother sang a lullaby in Bodé Wadmimwen. A boy traced clan symbols in the frost on a cabin window. And in a quiet field behind an old church, wild sage grew tall where once it had been trampled. The Potawatomi had been uprooted, scattered, silenced, but never broken. Their identity had not come undone. It had transformed, hardened like flint, rooted deeper than before. They were no longer just the keepers of the fire. They had become its carriers, across states, across centuries, across every attempt to snuff out what had once burned in the heart of the old forest. And so the fire burned on. In the kitchens where fry bread sizzled, in the council halls where resolutions were drafted, in the voices of children once again learning the words their great-grandparents had whispered in the dark. This was not just survival. This was sovereignty, hard won, hard kept, and still rising. By 1867, the Potawatomi stood at yet another crossroads. They had survived exile from Indiana, survived the trail of death, survived the quiet warfare of assimilation in Kansas. But survival, they had learned, comes not once. It comes again and again, in new shapes, in new forms, and sometimes in new names. That year, a treaty was offered by the United States government. Another document, another signature, another promise. But this one was different. This one invited the Potawatomi not just to relocate, but to become citizens of the very nation that had driven them westward. It was a proposition wrapped in legal nuance. But what it truly offered was a transformation of identity. A choice that fractured the nation itself. To accept the terms meant taking individual allotments in Indian territory, what would later become Oklahoma. It meant relinquishing shared landholding, stepping away from communal sovereignty, and adopting US citizenship under the banner of federal protection. And for those who accepted, it meant a new name, Citizen Potawatomi. It was not a decision made lightly. For some, it felt like betrayal. To take on the title citizen was, to their minds, to surrender to the very force that had hunted them, displaced them, punished their language, and buried their children far from ancestral soil. It was not progress. It was capitulation. One elder said, "The badge of your enemy does not make you safe, it makes you forget." But others saw something else. Not surrender, but strategy. They saw land that could be theirs to hold, permanently. Not as wards of the state, but as property owners. They saw schools, roads, the ability to vote, the power to influence laws. They saw their children with tools their ancestors had not known, and asked whether identity could survive not in isolation, but within the storm. The treaty was signed. The path split. Some families chose to remain in Kansas, maintaining traditional communal ties and rejecting citizenship entirely. Others moved south, deeper into Indian territory, where a new beginning waited, one marked not by wigwams and forest trails, but by new boundaries, new titles, and the shadow of American law. In the dry plains near present-day Shawnee, the citizen Potawatomi began to plant roots. They built homes, not wigwams, but cabins, frame houses, and sod structures. They broke the prairie with plows, dug wells, established towns with names like Sacred Heart and Wanette. But behind every hammer, every fence post, every stretch of barbed wire, was an echo of tension. Who are we now? Are we Potawatomi? Are we Americans? Are we both? The conflict was not just political, it was personal. Tribal councils in Oklahoma often turned heated. Elders who clung to ceremony clashed with younger men educated in federal schools. Some insisted on burning tobacco before every meeting. Others dismissed it as superstition. Some argued in Bodewad Mimwen, others in English. Some refused to speak to government agents except through interpreters. Others ran for office. A woman named Maud Gabau, who had walked the trail of death as a child, now found herself raising 6 children on 160 acres of wind-scorched land. Her husband had taken citizenship, she had not. Their children grew up between 2 worlds, one steeped in song and ceremony, the other in arithmetic and recitations of the Constitution. When her eldest son came home from a territorial school and refused to speak Potawatomi, Maud sat alone at dusk and whispered the old prayers into a clay bowl of cedar smoke. She wasn't praying for forgiveness. She was praying for memory. Even within families, the fracture ran deep. Brothers divided over whether to wear suits or feathers to funerals. Daughters raised in boarding schools declined to carry sacred bundles their grandmothers had protected for generations. There was no violence, no gunfire, but the tension was sharp enough to slice through blood. Still, in the heart of that tension, something else began to grow. Resilience was no longer just survival. It was reinvention. The citizen Potawatomi began establishing schools of their own, not ones where the language was banned, but where it was preserved, where math was taught alongside medicine songs, where the flagpole flew next to a cedar post tied with red cloth. They wrote laws, formed tribal councils, opened businesses, farms, and eventually, banks. They negotiated contracts, secured mineral rights, filed land claims in courtrooms far from the prairies their ancestors had walked. They became lawyers, teachers, politicians, not in spite of their heritage, but because of it. And yet, they never forgot what had been lost. The citizen Potawatomi carried ceremony in silence, dances conducted behind drawn curtains, bundles passed from hand to hand during winter moons. Stories once whispered only by firelight were transcribed, carefully, onto lined paper and locked in cedar boxes. An elder named Nokwet, whose name meant the last snow, said before her death, "To live is to change. But to live truly, you must remember what you were before." That remembering became the backbone of what would come next. The citizen Potawatomi were no longer just survivors of removal. They were no longer just voices echoing through lost forest trails. They had become something sharper, people who refused to be defined by their wounds. They held on to sovereignty even as they held citizenship. They honored treaties even as they fought them in court. They stood with feet in 2 worlds, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. It was not assimilation, it was adaptation. wielded like a blade. And as the 20th century loomed, the identity forged on the wind-swept plains of Indian territory would harden into legacy. A new chapter had begun, not of loss, but of power, not of silence, but of voice, and not of erasure, but of becoming. Some fires never go out. They dim, they smoulder, they flicker low in the ash, but they do not die. And in the heart of the 20th century, long after the treaties were signed, the land divided, and the songs silenced in schoolrooms, the Potawatomi fire began to glow again. It began not with grand declarations, but with whispers. An old woman named Teresa Wawatan stood before her stove in a one-room house outside Shawnee, Oklahoma. The year was 1949. Outside, a thin winter snow powdered the fields. Inside, she heated hominy in an iron pot and hummed a melody her grandmother used to sing, a lullaby in Bodewadmimwen. Her grandchildren watched television in the next room. They didn't understand the words, but something in the rhythm stilled them. They turned down the volume and listened. That is how it began. After decades of forced assimilation, the boarding schools, the allotments, the silencing of native tongues, the citizen Potawatomi nation found itself balanced on the edge of cultural extinction. The federal termination policies of the 1950s loomed like a final blow, threatening to sever the last threads of tribal sovereignty. Washington called it freedom. The nation knew it was erasure, but survival had never been about obeying. It had always been about remembering, and in those years, remembering became an act of rebellion. Elders like Frank Tessier, born at the turn of the century, began gathering the old stories, not for nostalgia, but for preservation. He wrote them down on scraps of ledger paper, spiral notebooks, backs of grocery receipts. Tales of the Seven Fires prophecy, of the migrations from the Great Lakes, of the sacred fire that had once burned at the center of the Potawatomi Lodge. He said, "If we forget, the land forgets us." At powwows once suppressed, dancers began to return in full regalia. The eagle feather, once confiscated in schools, rose again above the heads of young men. Jingle dresses, sewn by hand, shimmered beneath the Oklahoma sun as girls stepped in time to the heartbeat of a drum that had been silent too long. It was not spectacle, it was medicine. In 1961, under the weight of increasing federal pressure, tribal leaders gathered in secret to discuss how to save what remained of their heritage. Among them were women, strong, outspoken, and often the last keepers of language. One of them, Mildred Echohawk, proposed something radical. We stop asking to be remembered. We start reminding them who we are. She organized language circles, inviting children and teenagers to sit at folding tables in church basements, community halls, and kitchens, where they learned how to say grandmother again, how to count, how to speak to the trees, to the fire, to the Creator in the language that had once been banned. These weren't just words, they were threads, threads that rewove the nation's torn fabric, syllable by syllable. Young men like George Godfrey, who had grown up in the shadow of white textbooks and federal decrees, began to teach Potawatomi history in universities. Women formed beading groups, not just for craft, but to pass down the symbols of the clans: the bear, the thunder, the loon, the crane. Each stitch a prayer to the ancestors. Across the state, archives were opened. Elders stepped into recording studios, sometimes for the first time in their lives, to speak their names, tell their stories, sing their songs. Their voices were scratchy, old, but clear, defiant, alive. At the annual family reunion festival, what began as a small gathering of a few dozen soon grew into hundreds, then thousands. They came from cities, from farms, from distant states where Potawatomi blood had been scattered by history. They came carrying names once hidden in census records. They came with photographs, bundles, and prayers. They came not to celebrate survival, but to reclaim it. And in the middle of that gathering, a sacred fire was lit. Not for warmth, not for ceremony, but for identity. Because by the 1970s, the citizen Potawatomi Nation had begun to fight back, not with arrows or rifles, but with constitutions, court cases, and cultural revival. They sued for land, for recognition, for the right to define themselves. They launched tribal newspapers, radio broadcasts, and language apps. They didn't just speak the words of the past, they rewrote the future in them. Children once punished for speaking Bodewadmimwen now recited it at graduation ceremonies. Elders blessed new buildings with cedar smoke. Dancers opened parades in Washington, D.C., not as mascots or museum pieces, but as sovereign representatives of a living people. They began programs to bring back the lost names. They trained a new generation in traditional medicine, in bushcraft, in fire-starting techniques once used along the Great Lakes. They taught how to harvest wild onions in the spring, how to craft a talking stick, how to honor the 4 directions. Every act of culture was an act of resistance, and every moment of resistance was a spark. From those sparks, the fire reignited. In 1996, the Citizen Potawatomi Nation Cultural Heritage Center was founded. A space filled not just with artifacts, but with stories, sound, and memory. There, children saw the cradleboards of their ancestors, touched the tools their great-grandparents had carved by hand, and heard their language echo off stone walls for the first time. And yet, for all the technology, all the progress, the revival remained rooted in the simple acts. A grandmother teaching her grandson to braid sweetgrass. A father telling the 7 grandfather teachings by lantern light. A child speaking their name in a language once nearly lost. This was not the preservation of relics. This was the resurrection of spirit. In the quiet of night, when the fires burn low and the drums have faded, some say you can still hear them, the voices of those who walked the trail of death, who prayed in Kansas fields, who signed treaties with trembling hands but unbroken hearts. They did not leave this world. They became it. And now they dance with their descendants, every step a rhythm older than empire, every song a defiance of silence, every breath a promise that what was stolen would be taken back. The fire was never lost. It was only waiting. And now, it burns brighter than ever. On this land, there were once only wagons and winter winds. On this land, the Potawatomi buried their dead beside rivers they hadn't chosen and planted crops in soil that had never known their footsteps. On this land, they were expected to disappear. But they didn't. They built. And what they built was a nation. Not one born of conquest, but of resilience. Not one bound by blood alone, but by strategy, survival, and sovereignty, reclaimed through something no treaty could deny: economic power. By the dawn of the 21st century, the citizen Potawatomi Nation had survived every attempt to erase it, from removal to religious suppression, from boarding schools to broken treaties. But it wasn't enough to endure. To truly live, they had to thrive. The answer came not in firelight, but in balance sheets. It began with a single bank. In 2003, the citizen Potawatomi Nation purchased First National Bank of Shawnee, a modest institution with humble profits but limitless potential. It was more than a financial move. It was a declaration. No longer would the nation rely solely on grants or federal aid. No longer would their future be decided in someone else's office. They would write their own ledgers, and soon that one bank became 2, then 5, then more, under the banner of the Citizen Potawatomi Community Development Corporation, a lending institution designed not just to profit, but to empower. Single mothers received home loans, elders opened small businesses, young tribal citizens launched enterprises with low-interest startup capital. From welding shops to beadwork boutiques. This wasn't just banking. This was economic medicine, prescribed with memory and purpose. The next move was land. Tribal land, once stolen, sold, or tricked out from under their ancestors, was being bought back acre by acre. The nation invested in real estate, retail spaces, office complexes, housing developments. They weren't just recovering geography, they were rebuilding homeland. Then came the Grand Casino Hotel and Resort, a towering beacon along the I-40 corridor. For some, it looked like any modern entertainment complex. Slots, poker rooms, fine dining, luxury suites. But to the citizen Potawatomi, it was more than a place of leisure. It was a symbol, a place where profits didn't disappear into faceless corporations, but circled back into community programs, health clinics, language schools, scholarships, and cultural preservation. Every coin dropped into a machine became a drop in the reservoir of tribal sovereignty. Every room booked funded another step toward independence. Behind the scenes, the work was grueling. Financial analysts combed spreadsheets deep into the night. Tribal council meetings stretched long past sunset. Leaders debated investments not just for their return, but for their impact. There were setbacks, risks, critics, but they pressed forward, guided by something older than economics: responsibility. Because to be Potawatomi, truly Potawatomi, meant remembering not just who you are, but who you serve. The nation was not a business. It was a fire, tended by every generation. And now, economic growth became the new wood on that fire. The nation created over 2,000 jobs, not just for tribal members, but for the surrounding communities. They built a health system, a wellness center, a tribal court, and an education department that awarded thousands in scholarships each year. Children who once had to leave to find opportunity now found it within reach. A boy named Dylan Peltier, whose grandfather had cleaned hospital floors as a janitor, now attended college on a full tribal scholarship, studying public health to return and serve the nation. A grandmother, named Lorraine Nottaway, once denied a loan because of her heritage, opened a traditional food cafe with help from the nation's development fund. Her corn soup and fry bread now fed hundreds each week, along with a side of ancestral pride. And behind every spreadsheet, every job application, every construction site was the heartbeat of survival. This was not just capitalism, it was communal revival. At the helm were tribal leaders like John Rocky Barrett, who served the nation for decades. A quiet man with steel resolve, he understood that sovereignty wasn't won in speeches. It was earned, dollar by dollar, acre by acre. He said, "Sovereignty without economy is just a dream. We need the means to protect our people, not just the memory." Under his watch, the nation expanded its energy ventures, invested in sustainable infrastructure, and lobbied for stronger tribal rights on both state and national levels. Today, the citizen Potawatomi Nation's annual economic impact exceeds $500 million, a figure that would have once seemed unfathomable to those who walked the trail of death. But perhaps even more powerful is what that money protects: the language schools where children learn Bodewadmimwen alongside English, the cultural preservation department where elders teach traditional crafts, songs, and ceremonies, the Potawatomi Leadership Program where high school students learn what it means to govern, to lead, to carry the fire forward. This isn't nostalgia, it's strategy, because the greatest weapon the citizen Potawatomi ever held wasn't the tomahawk or rifle, it was adaptation, the same wisdom that guided their ancestors across the Great Lakes, the same cunning that kept them alive through wars, removals, and reservations. And now, in boardrooms and conference halls, that wisdom burns bright again. They have built a nation, not in spite of history, but because of it. One fire, one family, one future, lit not by chance, but by the relentless will to rise, not just to remember what was lost, but to secure what will never be taken again. The language was never just words. It was breath carved from the earth. It was memory encoded in syllables. It was how the Potawatomi spoke not just to each other, but to the trees, the stars, the fire, and the bones of their ancestors. Bodewadmimwen, the voice of the people of the fire. And for a time, it nearly disappeared. For generations, that voice was smothered, buried beneath the English tongue, in schoolrooms where speaking Potawatomi earned a slap to the mouth, a day of silence, a mark against the soul. Children were taught to forget the stories, forget the chants, forget the names of rivers, of spirits, of the winds that once guided their grandmothers home. By the 1970s, fewer than a dozen fluent speakers remained within the citizen Potawatomi nation. The silence was almost total. But language, like fire, does not die easily. It flickers, waits, hides in the lungs of the old, in the edges of lullabies, in the pauses between heartbeats. And in time, it rises. It began quietly. An elder named Mary Ann Peltier sat beneath a cottonwood tree, whispering words to herself in the dusk. Her granddaughter, only 7, asked what they meant. Mary Ann answered with a single sentence, "In Bode Wadmimwen." She didn't explain. She just repeated it. Again and again. The next night, her granddaughter whispered it back. That was the spark. In basements and borrowed classrooms, in community centres and kitchen tables, the nation began to gather, not in protest, but in resurrection. Language teachers, many of them second language learners themselves, started to document what remained. Every vowel, every verb. They recorded the elders who still spoke fluently, some hesitant, some clear, some holding words they hadn't spoken in years. Linguists were called in, but it was the community that did the work. They created flashcards, not for tourists, but for toddlers. They held immersion circles where no English was allowed, only breath, repetition, and laughter at mistakes made in sacred effort. There were challenges. Bode Wadmimwen is complex, polysynthetic, musical, layered in metaphor. One word can hold an entire sentence. A single prefix can change a spirit's mood. Intonation is not decoration, it is meaning. And yet, children learned it faster than adults. They sang it, they danced it, they spoke it in parking lots, in hallways, in text messages. They asked for juice in Bode Wadmimwen. They cursed playfully in Bode Wadmimwen. They prayed, shyly at first, in Bode Wadmimwen. It wasn't a class, it was revival. At the Citizen Potawatomi Language Department, a new generation of teachers emerged, many with no fluent parents, only fragments passed down in gestures and songs. One of them, Josiah Bourbonnais, recalled the first time he heard his son say, "Nimishumis," my grandfather. "I had to leave the room," he said. "I didn't want him to see me cry." Because in that word was more than lineage. It was return. Return to the lodges of the Great Lakes. Return to the council fires. Return to the breath of ancestors who once shaped the world with syllables like riverstones. The nation developed apps, online courses, digital dictionaries, and YouTube channels. They hosted language camps in the summer, where kids played tag in Bode Wadmimwen and built fires while naming the 4 directions. They composed new songs, not to replace the old, but to carry them forward. Ceremonial songs once banned were now taught openly. Words once whispered in hiding were now broadcast over speakers at powwows and graduation ceremonies. A young woman named Lenora Tecumseh gave her senior speech entirely in Potawatomi and received a standing ovation from an audience who didn't need to understand every word to feel its weight, because each syllable was a rebellion against extinction, and each phrase, a rope tied between centuries. But the revival was not just linguistic, it was spiritual. To speak Bode Wadmimwen is to walk in the old ways. It's to greet the sun as a relative, to ask permission before taking from the land, to tell a story not as fiction, but as living truth. It changes the way a person sees. One teacher explained, "We don't have a word for it in Potawatomi. Everything has spirit. Everything has agency. You can't talk about a tree like it's an object. It's your elder. It listens." That's what was stolen when the language was stripped away. Not just words, but relationship. And so, every student who learns to say Emno Bamadziwen, the good life, steps not just into knowledge, but into belonging. Today, in tribal government buildings, signs appear in both English and Bodewadmimwen. Public prayers open in Potawatomi. Children receive names in the language of their ancestors, names that once echoed in the forests of Michigan, on the shores of Lake Huron, along the forced trails into Kansas and Oklahoma. Names that were never forgotten, only waiting to be spoken again. The work continues. There is no illusion that the job is done. Fluency is rare. Resources are scarce. The world pulls young minds in 1,000 digital directions. But every generation holds more than the last. Every child who sings in Potawatomi shifts the balance. And every elder who hears their tongue reborn in the voices of youth knows the truth of what was once feared lost. The fire still burns, in the throat, in the chest, in the breath. Bodewadmimwen lives, not in museums, not on plaques, but in classrooms, in homes, in the prayers whispered into cedar smoke, in the jokes told between cousins at midnight, in the first word a baby says, and the last word a grandfather speaks. Language was never only a tool. For the Potawatomi, it is inheritance. It is resistance. It is home. In every village, in every camp, in every dark hour when the nation bent beneath the weight of history, there was always a woman tending the fire. She did not always speak. She did not always lead from the front. But she knew, as surely as breath, that if the fire died, the people would not survive. Among the Potawatomi, women have always carried the flame, not just literally, in the sacred embers of the Midewiwin lodges, where spiritual knowledge passed from elder to apprentice, but in the rhythm of daily life, in the quiet repetition of language, in the healing hands that gathered plants, brewed teas, birthed children, and buried the dead with prayers still wet in the throat. They were not warriors in the European sense. They were something older, something deeper, stewards of continuity, guardians of culture, healers in times of war and weavers of strength in exile. On the trail of death in 1838, when over 850 Potawatomi were driven from Indiana to Kansas, many men died along the march. Some from sickness, others from broken spirits. But the women, they walked on. One of them was Margaret Topinabee, a grandmother of 6. She buried 2 grandchildren along that road, one from dysentery, the other from fever. She had no shovels, only her hands. And still, each night, she lit a small fire, fed it dried bark from her medicine pouch, and whispered the same prayer. Keep us, guide us, wake us tomorrow. Those prayers, and the women who carried them, became the spine of the nation. And when the removals ended, when the hunger and grief settled into the bones of a scattered people, it was the women who picked up what was left, the songs, the medicines, the names, and began to rebuild. In Kansas, under the thumb of missionaries and government agents, they were told to forget. Forget the bundles, forget the herbs, forget the stories about thunderbirds and water spirits and the clans that once shaped governance. But women like Josephine Shabona didn't. She passed her knowledge in code, wrapping plant bundles in quilts, teaching her daughter to sing lullabies in Bodewadmimwen, even as the priests told them the language was heathen. They called her stubborn. She called it survival. And as generations turned, that stubbornness became tradition. In the 20th century, when federal termination policies threatened the very legal existence of the citizen Potawatomi nation, it was a woman, Catherine White Crow, who gathered tribal records from storage sheds and basements, filing them into folders she protected like children. Without those papers, the tribe's legal foundation might have vanished. But Catherine knew what it meant to guard something invisible until the moment it was needed. The fire doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it just waits. In classrooms across Oklahoma, tribal women became the first to teach Potawatomi children their history, not as myth or shame, but as legacy. Dr. Renee Barasa, a professor and language activist, began compiling oral histories from Potawatomi matriarchs in the 1980s. She spent years traveling backroads in a rusted pickup, sitting with elders who had once been forbidden to speak their mother tongue. One of them, Evelyn Thunderwoman, whispered to her, "I kept the language in my mouth for 60 years, waiting for someone to ask me for it." Dr. Barasa gave her a microphone, and the world listened. In courtrooms too, the fire was carried forward. Judge Mary Peltier Bailey, one of the nation's first female judges, ruled not only with law, but with memory. Her courtroom echoed with more than statutes. It echoed with custom, with the understanding that justice, for her people, was not just punishment, but restoration. She once said, "We are not trying to recreate the old ways. We are trying to bring their truth into a new world." And in doing so, she lit torches for others to follow. In clinics, tribal women heal with both stethoscopes and cedar smoke. Dr. Lila Mko, trained in Western medicine but raised with traditional remedies, treats both body and spirit. She listens first, not just to symptoms, but to stories. Because in Potawatomi belief, illness does not begin in the flesh. It begins in disconnect, from community, from self, from land. That's what the women fight, disconnection. And they fight it with presence, with songs sung at dawn, with regalia stitched late at night, with hands that teach, build, tend, and guide, never seeking credit, only continuity. Today, across the citizen Potawatomi Nation, women serve in nearly every leadership role: council members, educators, historians, cultural preservationists. But their power is not new. It is simply recognized. And still, it is in the quiet places where their work speaks loudest, in the hush of a cradleboard ceremony, in the voice of a teenage girl reciting her clan's creation story for the first time, in the rhythmic scraping of a deer hide passed down 4 generations. The flame they carry is not just tradition, it is defiance. Against forgetting, against assimilation, against the slow erosion of identity by systems designed to erase it. And yet, through it all, through war, displacement, colonization, and bureaucracy, the women held on. And when their hands were too tired, they passed the flame to the next. It was never dropped. It was never lost. Because among the Potawatomi, to be a woman was never to be behind. It was to be beneath, like roots beneath a tree, unseen, but holding everything aloft. It was to be within, like blood, like breath, like prayer. It was to be the firekeeper. And today, as drums sound at powwows and children speak Bodewad Mimwen with laughter instead of shame, their work continues, in the unseen corners, in the smallest gestures. In every sacred circle, every tribal council, every family meal where wild rice is passed and stories are told in the old cadence, you will find them. Still tending, still feeding, still keeping the fire alive. Because while men may light the flame, it is the women who carry it through the storm. From ashes to sovereignty. For the citizen Potawatomi Nation, survival was never just about breath and blood. It was about governance, the ability to make decisions for themselves, by themselves, on land taken, reclaimed, and held not with rifles or rage, but with law, leadership, and relentless memory. A century ago, the idea of native sovereignty was often treated like a relic, ceremonial, symbolic, and powerless. But the Potawatomi never saw it that way. To them, sovereignty wasn't a privilege, it was inheritance. Burned into treaties, etched into trails of exile, whispered between generations, and now, written into law. In 2007, the citizen Potawatomi Nation ratified its modern constitution, a document born not in Washington, but in tribal council chambers, kitchen tables, and prayer circles. It was drafted by Potawatomi minds, debated by Potawatomi voices, and ratified by Potawatomi voters, a living embodiment of what it means to govern not as guests on stolen land, but as nations on their own terms. Their governmental structure is elegant in its complexity. A tribal legislature with 16 elected representatives, one for each family lineage, plus 5 at-large seats. Each law passed must honor both the wisdom of the ancestors and the needs of a 21st century people. Every vote echoes with questions older than America itself. How do you balance tradition with technology, custom with commerce, spiritual duty with legal obligation? And above all, how do you define who belongs? Because at the core of modern Potawatomi governance lies a tension, deep and personal, identity. In the past, you were Potawatomi because you spoke the language, danced the dances, carried the bundles, followed the ceremonies. Today, it's more complicated. Blood quantum, a concept imposed by federal policy, not tribal worldview, still lingers. On enrollment forms, in court cases, in quiet conversations that ask who counts and who decides. A child born with a Potawatomi mother but no blood degree might be denied legal recognition, while another, far removed from culture but carrying the paperwork, is counted as kin. It's not about exclusion, it's about survival. Because when your numbers determine your funding, your lands, your rights, then numbers start to matter. And yet, behind every number is a story. A child adopted out of the nation, now grown, seeking reconnection. A grandmother who never learned the language but made sure her grandchildren did. A man who doesn't meet the blood requirement, but still fasts on hilltops and teaches the drum. Belonging, in the modern era, is no longer just a matter of lineage. It's a matter of commitment, and the nation has begun to reflect that shift, expanding access to cultural programs, supporting those returning home, rewriting enrollment laws not to dilute identity, but to protect it. It's a delicate balance, one the tribal court wrestles with daily. Led by elected judges trained in both federal law and tribal custom, the court system handles everything from land disputes and child welfare to constitutional interpretation. But these are not abstract cases. They are sacred duties. Because land, for the Potawatomi, is not just property. It is story. It is medicine. It is responsibility. The nation's land management office oversees more than 10,000 acres, not as a real estate firm, but as a steward of ancestral obligations. Every acre, reacquired from non-native ownership, is a ceremony in itself, a silent undoing of dispossession. Each prairie reseeded, each waterway protected, each burial site restored, is an act of sovereignty beyond law. It is memory, enforced. But governance doesn't happen in isolation. The citizen Potawatomi Nation negotiates with state and federal governments not as subordinates, but as sovereigns. They draft compacts, argue jurisdiction, and walk into courtrooms with the full weight of tribal law behind them. And they win. Not always, but often enough to remind the world the fire never went out. One example. The 2020 McGirt decision in the US Supreme Court, though not a Potawatomi case, reaffirmed what Native nations have known all along, that treaties still matter, that borders drawn in ink are as real as the rivers they cut across. That sovereignty is not a metaphor. It is a legal, living force, and the citizen Potawatomi Nation wields it with purpose. In education, they operate schools where tribal history is not a sidebar, but the backbone of the curriculum. In public health, they've built clinics where traditional medicine is offered alongside modern care, because healing must happen in both body and spirit. In elections, every tribal member, whether in Oklahoma or across the country, can vote for representatives, propose legislation, and shape the nation's future. This is not assimilation. This is adaptation, on their own terms. And yet, questions remain. What does it mean to be Potawatomi in a world of global identities, digital culture, and urban diaspora? Can you be fully Potawatomi if you've never been to Oklahoma? If you don't know your clan? If you speak only English? The answer, according to tribal leaders, is not found in purity tests, but in participation. If you carry the fire, you belong. If you show up, if you learn, if you remember, then governance is not just a system, it is a ceremony. It is the act of gathering, the writing of laws in the name of ancestors, the passing of resolutions not just for budgets and buildings, but for honor, for protection, for permanence. This is what it means to be Potawatomi today, to build a government from ashes, to reclaim not just land, but the right to decide your own story. And in that story, told in council halls, classrooms, courtrooms, and powwow grounds, the fire still burns, not as a symbol, not as myth, but as law, as language, as land, as legacy. The citizen Potawatomi nation is not a remnant. It is not a shadow of what once was. It is a sovereign people, still writing their constitution, still defending their sovereignty, still welcoming home those who wandered, still choosing each day to rise from the ashes and to govern, not as victims, but as a nation, reborn by fire and unbroken by time. It begins, as it always has, with flame, not the kind that rages, not the kind that consumes, but the kind that remembers, the kind that endures. Among the Potawatomi, fire has never simply meant heat or light. It is a presence, older than war, older than migration, older than the names printed in treaty ink. It is spirit made visible, and it still burns. Today, in a grove outside Shawnee, a group of young Potawatomi gather in silence. They have painted their faces with red earth. Some wear ribbon skirts, some wear baseball caps. All of them carry tobacco. All of them know this moment is not about performance. It is about continuity. They kneel, one by one, and offer their prayers to a sacred fire that has burned for generations. And as the smoke rises, so too does the memory of those who carried it, across rivers, through snow, into exile and back again. This is not the past. This is now. Because to be Potawatomi in the 21st century is not to reenact history, but to inherit it and carry it forward. You can see it in the hands of a grandmother teaching a child to weave black ash baskets, in the eyes of a high schooler reciting Bodewad Mimwen from a mobile app, in the laughter around a drum circle echoing across asphalt and sagebrush alike. There was a time when silence threatened to erase all of this, when the fire scattered, in boarding schools, on reservations, in courtrooms and hospitals and homes, where children were taught that their culture was shame, their language a sin, their ancestors only footnotes. But even then, the embers survived, carried in bundles hidden under floorboards, whispered in lullabies, folded into church hymns by women who remembered the old cadences beneath the new ones. The fire never died. It only waited for a generation ready to reclaim it and reignite it. Today, the citizen Potawatomi nation is a sovereign force, not just in government, not just in economy, but in spirit. It is felt in the rhythm of stomp dances, in the warmth of meals shared after naming ceremonies, in the pride of elders watching their great-grandchildren speak the words they once feared to utter. And yet, this is not nostalgia. This is a forward gaze. In conference rooms lit by fluorescent bulbs, tribal leaders debate the future of healthcare, housing, and education with the same intensity once reserved for battlefield strategy. In laboratories and law schools, young Potawatomi are merging ancestral knowledge with modern science, creating medicines from ancient herbs, drafting constitutions shaped by both tribal law and environmental ethics. A new generation walks between worlds, fluent in both, not torn between them, not choosing one over the other, but weaving them together. This is what sovereignty looks like. Not just casinos and land trusts, but the right to define what thriving means, on their own terms. And still, it always comes back to the fire. In every major ceremony, from the naming of a child to the burial of an elder, a flame is lit. It is not symbolic. it is sacred. And at its center lies the truth of a people unbroken. From the forest trails of the Great Lakes, to the blood-soaked road of the Trail of Death, to the concrete foundations of modern tribal headquarters, the Potawatomi flame has passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, through grief, through silence, through survival. And now it burns, not in hiding, but in strength. The sacred fire still burns in the hearts of a people who were never meant to remain. A people who were hunted, displaced, divided, assimilated, ignored, but never extinguished. A people who once slept in wigwams lined with birch bark, and now build homes of steel and cedar, still adorned with the scent of sweetgrass. A people who once tracked game through forest mist, and now walk boardrooms in suits stitched with clan symbols. A people who once sang to the rising sun for protection, and now teach their children to sing those same songs, in classrooms, online, and across oceans. The fire burns in every act of resistance, in every choice to remember, in every refusal to vanish. And as night falls on the plains once more, another circle gathers. The wind has changed, the world has changed, but the ceremony, it remains. A young boy places his tobacco on the flames. His voice cracks with uncertainty. His grandmother rests her hand on his shoulder and begins to sing. And just like that, it becomes clear. This story is not ending. It is beginning, again and again, with every child who learns, every elder who teaches, every moment that honors the fire. From embers to blaze, the flame has traveled. It has burned across borders, through centuries, through trauma and triumph. It is not a metaphor. It is not a memory. It is the living, breathing truth of the citizen Potawatomi nation, still here, still rising, still burning. And as long as that flame remains, so too will the people who keep it, forever the keepers of the fire.